Hey guys, tonight we're travelling way back to figure out when people started smoking weed. And trust me, it's older than your uncle's Bob Marley poster. We're talking thousands of years ago, long before vape pens and dispensary loyalty cards. Like if you're hoping to smoke ancient vibes with a cave-dwelling mystic under a fur blanket, you're actually not far off. But here's your spoiler alert. You probably won't survive this. Between the rough terrain, unfiltered fires, and mysterious herbs being burned in poorly ventilated tents, your ancient adventure might be more of a short film than a feature-length experience. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your city and time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the windswept grasslands of Central Asia. It's night time. The sky is huge and starlit, and your boots crunch softly on frost-tipped grass. Somewhere in the distance, wolves are having a loud opinion about something. You've just wandered into the land of the ancient Scythians, a nomadic people known for their horse archery, gold jewellery, and surprisingly, their love of ritualistic cannabis smoke. Yes, before dispensaries had loyalty punch cards, these folks were lighting it up inside felt tents. It's around 500 BCE, and the vibe is somewhere between ancient Burning Man and spiritual steam bath. A group of Scythian warriors, still dusty from a long ride, are crouched around a small iron bowl that's filled with burning cannabis seeds and flowers. You're politely invited inside the tent. Well, it's less of an invitation and more of a hand gesture followed by being gently pulled in. You duck your head, step inside, and boom, you're instantly engulfed in a cloud of thick, piney, eye-stinging smoke. It's intense. There's coughing, a lot of it. You're sweating from the heat of the rocks, and someone starts humming in a droning chant that makes your head feel like it's floating on a hot spring. This, according to Greek historian Herodotus, who had a bit of a gossip streak, is how the Scythians got their spiritual cleanse on. They'd heat stones, toss cannabis onto them, and let the smoke do the rest. It makes them shout for joy, he wrote, which is a pretty classy way to describe a prehistoric hotbox party. Here's the thing. Cannabis wasn't just for fun back then. For these nomadic tribes, it was sacred. Part of funeral rites. Part of spiritual cleansing. There wasn't exactly a user's manual, but this was no casual Friday night puff. You didn't light up unless it meant something. You rub your eyes, trying to adjust to the smoky glow. Around you, warriors sit cross-legged, their silhouettes flickering like shadows in the firelight. The air is heavy, not just with smoke, but with meaning. You're not just inhaling cannabis, you're stepping into a belief system, one where smoke bridges the gap between the physical world and whatever lies beyond it. Now, archaeologists didn't believe this right away. For a long time, people thought Herodotus was just exaggerating, maybe writing a little stoner fan fiction of his own. But in 2019, researchers digging through burial mounds in the Pamir Mountains of western China found wooden braziers with scorched cannabis residue. And not just any cannabis, it was high in THC. That's right, these ancient folks weren't accidentally lighting up hemp socks. They knew exactly what they were doing. That discovery pulled the conversation out of the maybe column and plopped it right into the oh wow, they were actually doing this folder. It confirmed that ritual cannabis use in Central Asia was real, intentional and chemically effective. But here's your quirky fact of the night. The same burial mounds where these ancient braziers were found also contained harps, actual stringed instruments. So it's possible these funeral ceremonies weren't just smoky, they had soundtracks. Imagine someone playing haunting melodies while cannabis smoke swirls around the tent, like the original lo-fi beats to relax and transcend your soul to. Of course, this all raises questions scholars are still debating. Were the Scythians and their neighbours using cannabis strictly for ritual? Or were they just very spiritually committed to getting high? Was the psychoactive effect a happy accident, or something they bred for intentionally? And why were their cannabis strains stronger than expected? Was this ancient botany, or just really lucky gardening? You take a slow breath. Okay, half a breath, because it still smells like burning sage, pine, and whatever that is. Your eyes sting a little. The warriors are laughing now, quietly, in the way people laugh when they don't need language. You can't understand their words, but you don't really need to. The fire crackles. The music hums. Time feels like it's slowing down and dissolving, and suddenly you feel a little less like a time-travelling outsider and more like someone sitting exactly where they need to be. And then one of the warriors, face painted with swirling black lines, leans in and offers you a carved wooden pipe. You hesitate. Not because you're nervous. Okay, maybe a little. But because you're thinking of that old saying, when in Scythia, you don't take the pipe, at least not yet. Instead, you tilt your head back and let the smoke curl around you, earthy and wild like the ghost of a plant that grew under forgotten stars. Your eyes sting a little less now. You're acclimating, adjusting, becoming part of this strange cloud of time. And while the warriors are deep into their ritual haze, you start thinking, not just about the smoke in your lungs, but about the plant itself. Like, who first looked at this tall, wiry weed and thought, I should dry this and set it on fire? So you decide to rewind the timeline, step outside the tent, back into the cold, into the wind-whipped grasslands, and now you're going even further back, way before fire bowls and burial rituals. You're headed to the first chapters of humanity's relationship with cannabis sativa. And surprise, it didn't start with smoking. You find yourself in ancient Taiwan, around 10,000 years ago. That's not a typo. You're deep in the Neolithic era, when people still thought agriculture was a bold new idea, and domesticated animals meant that goat we didn't eat yet. Here, cannabis wasn't about vibes. It was about survival. People were using the strong, fibrous stalks of the plant to make rope, nets, and eventually early versions of cloth. That's right. Before cannabis got you high, it helped you tie your boat to a rock. Walk a little further across this ancient landscape, and you'll see evidence of cannabis popping up independently in multiple places. China, Korea, Central Asia. Everywhere early farmers realized, hey, this stringy plant is kind of amazing. It grows fast, doesn't need much pampering, and if you twist it just right, it becomes one of the strongest natural fibers around. It wasn't glamorous, but it was useful. They didn't need rituals. They needed rope that didn't snap when a fish thrashed against the net. You run your fingers across a coarsely woven hemp mat hanging in a smoke-stained hut. And yeah, it's scratchy, but it'll last longer than anything you bought on clearance last week. And this isn't just a local trend. For millennia, people valued cannabis primarily for its utility. It's the duct tape of ancient plants. Need to tie down a shelter? Hemp. Need to make paper? Hemp. Need to soothe that goat bite on your leg? The seeds make a nice salve when crushed. Even today, hemp seeds are a trendy smoothie add-in, but to ancient people, they were a source of vital protein and oil. Now here's your quirky fact. Some early evidence shows that cannabis was buried with the dead long before people started smoking it. Not in braziers or pipes, but just the plant itself. Like grave goods, kind of a prehistoric, here, take this with you. You might need it in the afterlife moment. Was it meant as medicine, a textile gift, a spiritual offering? That part's fuzzy. But what's clear is that cannabis held meaning, even in its non-psychoactive forms. And here's the scholarly debate you'll love to float on like a dandelion seed. When did people actually start noticing the mind-altering effects of cannabis? Because here's the thing, not all cannabis is created equal. The plant has multiple subspecies, including cannabis sativa and cannabis indica, and their chemical profiles vary. THC, the stuff that makes your brain say wow, doesn't always occur in large amounts. Early hemp plants probably didn't do much beyond making you slightly sleepy and very regular. So did ancient people start selectively growing the stronger stuff on purpose? Or was it a happy accident, like someone tossing a handful of seeds onto an ash pile and ending up with a whole new vibe the following spring? Some scholars argue that humans didn't really discover the drug-like properties of cannabis until much later, closer to 3,000 years ago, in places like the Hindu Kush Mountains, where wild cannabis naturally had more THC. Others say that early people had to notice something. I mean, if you're burning piles of plant matter in a closed hut, someone's bound to feel a little funny eventually. Back in your time-travelling headspace, you're now seated in a humble Neolithic shelter. A woman crouches by a fire, scraping hemp fibres and twisting them into cord. She doesn't say anything to you, because she can't see you, but she hums softly, a little tuneless melody that somehow echoes through time. You notice she's using stone tools to process the stalks, scraping them clean, drying them by the fire. She's not thinking about getting high, she's thinking about making fish nets strong enough to survive another season. In the corner there's a bowl of seeds, cannabis seeds, round and glossy. They're not for planting, they're for eating. Roasted maybe, nutty and rich in oil. You pop one into your mouth, it's earthy, a little chewy, and surprisingly satisfying, no buzz, just nutrition. And this is what's so often forgotten in the great weed debates of today. This plant started as a workhorse, a tough, loyal, multi-purpose tool that helped build early human life. You weren't sitting around debating strains. You were trying to fix a broken net before sunset. Of course, time keeps moving. Knowledge evolves. Someone, somewhere, eventually noticed that certain plants made you feel different. Maybe it started with a particularly funky batch of seeds. Maybe it was a stress relief moment after harvest season, like, hey, what if we burned the leftover flowers and sat real close to the fire? And then someone laughed for 10 minutes and forgot why. But here, in this moment, under this low Neolithic ceiling, there's no euphoria, no coughing, just the creak of twine being twisted into cord, the crackle of fire, and the slow hum of a world discovering the quiet power of a plant. Not the buzz, not yet, just the beginnings. By now you've been everywhere from hemp-twisting huts to smoky tents full of chanting warriors, and honestly your lungs could use a break. But history has other plans for you. As you drift forward again, like a stray seed caught on a breeze, you land in ancient China. It's somewhere around 2700 BCE, give or take a myth or two, and the world smells a little like crushed herbs and distant incense. Welcome to the birthplace of not just silken fireworks, but also the earliest known cannabis medicine cabinet. You're in the company of Shen Nong, the so-called divine farmer, who's basically the Johnny Appleseed of Chinese herbal medicine. According to legend, he has a transparent belly so he can watch how plants affect his organs. Honestly, it sounds like something someone dreamed up halfway through a fever. But here he is, hunched over scrolls and dried leaves, chewing something green and looking deeply unimpressed. His ancient pharmacopoeia, Shenong Benkao Jing, would go on to mention cannabis as a treatment for things like rheumatism, menstrual disorders, and, awkwardly enough, forgetfulness. Which feels like a bit of irony baked right into the leaves. You're in a quiet courtyard now, watching as young herbalists grind cannabis seeds into paste and steep flowers into bitter tea. It's not recreational, it's precise, methodical, closer to alchemy than anything you'd recognize as getting high. People sip it slowly, under supervision. You lean in to smell the concoction. It's grassy, bitter, a little spicy, like the breath of an overwatered plant trying its best. Here, cannabis is called mei, and it's treated with deep respect. The ancient Chinese viewed it as one of these superior elixirs, meaning it was thought to balance yin and yang, regulate energy, and promote longevity. And before you roll your eyes too hard, just remember, this was a culture that mapped the human body with the precision of subway systems, and studied qi long before you had an app to track your breathing. But here's your quirky fact. Ancient Chinese burial sites have yielded cannabis plants buried with the dead, not woven into rope, not pressed into medicine, but laid whole beside the body. That's either a final gift or someone really didn't want to lose their dealer. Jokes aside, it points to deeper symbolic meaning. Cannabis wasn't just a tool, it was something you might need in the next world. As you move through these centuries-old apothecaries, you notice that the cannabis being used isn't necessarily psychoactive. Most of it's industrial hemp, tough, fibrous, low in THC. So here's where the scholarly tug-of-war kicks in. Some researchers argue that early Chinese cannabis culture wasn't about intoxication at all. Others suggest that psychoactive strains did exist, but were reserved for shamanic rituals or ceremonies so rare that they left only faint footprints in the historical record. And speaking of shamans, let's go ahead and drift a little westward, up into the high-altitude valleys of western China. It's cold here. Snow dusts the mountains, and you're watching a group of Bronze Age people prepare for a funeral ceremony. In 2016, archaeologists discovered a 2,500-year-old burial site near the town of Turpan, where they found an entire cannabis shroud draped over the body of a man. No lie. 13 whole female plants placed carefully across his chest like a leafy green blanket. Were they sending him off in style? Protecting him from evil spirits? Ensuring he had something to barter with in the great beyond? No one really knows. But the plants were mature and clearly cultivated, not just plucked from a wild field. So even this early, people were farming cannabis with intention. Inside a small ritual tent, someone drops dried cannabis onto hot stones. The smell is sharper than before, pungent, almost peppery. It cuts through the cold like a whisper from the underworld. People sway, softly chanting. Their eyes are half lidded, not from sleep, but from something deeper, slower. This isn't casual indulgence. This is ceremony. The line between medicine and mysticism is blurred here, like smoke in a mirror. You wonder whether the people participating really understood the chemical properties at work, or if they just knew, intuitively, that this plant could open doors to places your waking mind couldn't quite reach. And then you think, maybe that's all anyone's ever known about it, even now. As you pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and step out of the tent into a frozen night, stars wheeling overhead like burning seeds, you realise something else. Cannabis wasn't a global joke yet. It wasn't a stoner stereotype or a political talking point. It was still quiet, still sacred, still something whispered about among the flames. And here's the academic argument that still rumbles through scholarly papers like a low drumbeat. Was cannabis part of mainstream Chinese culture, or was it always a fringe substance, tucked away in the toolkits of healers and visionaries? Was it a backbone crop or a spiritual supplement? And how much did the psychoactive versions really matter compared to the industrial uses? The lines blur. Historians can't agree, but that's kind of perfect, isn't it? You walk back through the moonlit fields where the cannabis once grew, brushing your hands along the stalks that rustle in the breeze like they're telling secrets. You can almost hear ancient voices in the wind, herbalists, shamans, farmers, all connected by this strange resilient plant. You reach down, pull one gently from the soil, and for a moment it feels like holding a thread that stretches across 5,000 years. You don't light it, not yet. You just hold it and listen. You're not sure when the wind shifts, but suddenly it's warm again. Sticky warm, in that way only the Indian subcontinent can be. Air thick with humidity and something floral riding on it. Maybe jasmine or maybe some mystery plant used in temple garlands. You're in ancient India now, somewhere between 2000 and 1000 BCE, and this place smells like old stone, sandalwood, and sweet milk boiling in clay pots. You wipe your forehead, squint up at the sun, and immediately realise you've just stepped into one of the longest-running cannabis love affairs in human history. Because India didn't just tolerate cannabis, it elevated it. Sacred texts, the Vedas, call it one of the 5 sacred plants, gifted by the gods themselves. According to legend, when the gods churned the cosmic ocean, as one does, they produced amrita, the nectar of immortality. A few drops spilled onto the ground, and from those drops sprouted the cannabis plant. That's right, divine spillage. You don't get more mythic than that. Walk into the heart of a village during a festival and you'll see it. Big brass pots filled with a cold, greenish drink called pang, made by grinding cannabis leaves into a paste and mixing it with milk, spices, sugar, and sometimes almonds. You're handed a cup before you can decline, and the taste hits somewhere between pistachio ice cream and liquefied lawn clippings. But it's oddly pleasant, and very slowly everything starts to feel just a touch softer around the edges. But this isn't about getting high in the recreational sense. Here, bang is ceremonial. You're surrounded by colour, chanting, and marigolds. You're not at a rave, you're at a temple celebration for Lord Shiva, who, by the way, is the original poster deity for cannabis. People say he discovered the plant while wandering the Himalayas, exhausted and sun-stroked. After resting in the shade of a tall cannabis plant, he ate some of its leaves, felt revived, and became forever associated with its energy. So now, every year, millions of Hindus drink bhang during Mahashivaratri, a sacred night devoted to Shiva. It's not about escaping reality, it's about transcending it. You're supposed to pray, meditate, and possibly giggle at nothing in particular for a little while. You sip your bhang again. It's grainy near the bottom. There's a chill in your limbs now, but your mind feels oddly spacious. You stroll past pilgrims smeared with ash, their eyes bright, voices slow, offering small clumps of cannabis at roadside shrines. The line between devotion and inebriation is blurred here, but no one's judging. In fact, in some holy cities like Varanasi, ascetics called sadhus openly smoke cannabis from clay pipes called chillums, sharing hits as part of spiritual practice. You watch as they close their eyes, puff the smoke skyward, and exhale prayers like dragons who've seen some things. Here's your quirky fact for this stop. Bhang is legally sold in parts of India to this day, often from government-regulated shops with names like Pang Center Number. 3, which sounds like a cross between a pharmacy and a secret lair. And yes, you can walk up and order cannabis-infused drinks with the same casual tone you'd use for a mango lassi. Just maybe don't chug it all at once unless you have nowhere to be for the next 6 hours. But here's where it gets complicated, and where scholars still argue over cultural nuance. Was cannabis use always this spiritually sanctioned? Or did that association evolve slowly, layered with centuries of ritual, folk medicine, and creative interpretation? Some academics believe Pang use was originally limited to specific priestly classes and expanded over time into folk tradition. Others argue that cannabis was always deeply embedded in rural religious practices, far from the polished temples and Sanskrit scribes. Like most things in history, it's probably both, and neither, and impossible to pin down neatly. You walk through a bustling market now, and there are stalls selling all kinds of cannabis products. Nothing labelled, but you can smell it. Some people chew it with betel leaf, others boil it into sweet syrups. You're offered a piece of sticky cannabis candy wrapped in dried banana leaf. It's surprisingly strong, and your steps slow as your thoughts stretch. But even here, amid spiritual highs and sweet milk drinks, you can feel the shift. Not everyone approves. Some rulers over the centuries tried to regulate or ban cannabis, calling it distracting or morally questionable. There were edicts, debates, and more than one official side-eye directed at holy men with bloodshot eyes. And yet the plant persisted, woven into the spiritual, medical, and culinary threads of Indian life. Even in Ayurvedic medicine, the ancient wellness system still practiced today, cannabis holds a place. It's considered both powerful and dangerous, a double-edged leaf that can heal or harm, depending on who's wielding it. It's used to treat digestion, insomnia, anxiety, and more. But always with balance. Always under supervision. This isn't the modern, take 2 gummies and hope for the best philosophy. It's cautious, deliberate. You sit down beneath a banyan tree as the sky shifts orange and pink. A wandering musician plays a slow, looping melody on a stringed instrument. And nearby, 2 old men argue, very softly, about whether Shiva prefers chillum smoke or bhang. You lean your head back against the tree, letting their voices drift past. You're not sure there's a right answer. Maybe Shiva's cool with both. You close your eyes, and for a moment it all clicks. The reverence, the ritual, the long history of a plant that's never quite just a plant. Not here. Not in India. Here, cannabis isn't just a drug. It's an offering, a teacher, a companion for the soul as it tries to reach somewhere a little higher. You're still warm, still feeling the echo of bells and the taste of bhang lingering on your tongue, but the light starts to shift again. The air dries out. The colours get dustier. You blink, and the marigolds are gone, replaced by olive trees, white stone columns, and the distant murmur of the sea. Welcome to the Mediterranean, ancient Greece to be exact. The age of tunics, togas, and philosophers who spent entire afternoons arguing about whether reality even existed. And somewhere between their arguments and their amphorae of wine, you start to wonder, did they ever light up? The answer is, probably, kind of. Maybe. This part of history is where things get delightfully vague. Unlike India and China, which had the decency to write stuff down clearly, the Greeks and their neighbours were a little more cryptic when it came to cannabis. But you've learned to read the signs, and the signs here are all pointing to yes, though with a little side of plausible deniability. You're walking now through an open-air market in Athens, around the 5th century BCE. The air smells like grilled fish, sun-warmed pottery, and crushed herbs. You pass stalls where people sell olive oil, honey cakes, and bundles of dried plants tied together with twine. One of those bundles looks suspiciously familiar. Long, thin leaves, sharp edges, a faintly skunky scent if you lean in. You don't say anything. Neither does the seller. You just raise an eyebrow, and she gives you the tiniest nod. Cannabis wasn't a star player in ancient Greek texts. It shows up, but quietly. The physician Dioscorides wrote about it in the 1st century CE, calling it cannabis, and noting that it could be used to treat inflammation and earaches. Earlier mentions are more subtle, but the Greeks were connected to the Scythians, remember them? The hotboxing nomads from the steppe. Well, the Greeks loved to trade with them, and the Scythians brought more than gold and horses, they brought habits. So now you're at a symposium, not the PowerPoint kind, but the kind where aristocratic men recline on couches, drink wine, and talk about philosophy until someone falls asleep or tries to sing. You're the quiet guest in the corner, watching as a thin column of smoke rises from a bronze dish. It's not incense. It's not just sage or myrrh. It smells sharper, earthier. Someone leans over and mutters something about Scythian fire, and everyone chuckles like it's an inside joke. One guy tries to quote Plato but forgets halfway through and just shrugs. You feel a little lighter yourself. The thing is, Greek society had a complicated relationship with intoxication. Wine, totally acceptable, as long as it was watered down and sipped slowly. Drunkenness, a bit gauche, unless you were at a Dionysian festival, in which case all bets were off. Cannabis? Well, it wasn't centre stage, but it definitely lurked behind the curtains. And then there are the Scythians again, still doing their smoky rituals. Greek historians loved writing about them, especially Herodotus, who couldn't resist adding a few dramatic flourishes. You hear whispers among the Greeks about those strange northern people who ride horses, pierce everything, and sit in tents filled with strange vapours. They inhale it, someone says with a shudder, deliberately. But here's your quirky twist. Cannabis might have also played a role in funerary practices among Thracians and Dacians, neighbours to the Greeks, who used mind-altering substances in their death rituals. There's archaeological evidence of burned cannabis seeds in burial sites around the Black Sea, suggesting that the Scythian approach wasn't all that isolated. It spread, quietly, like smoke under a door. Now you're drifting toward the eastern edges of the Greek world, into Persia, where Zoroastrianism is on the rise. Here, cannabis might have been part of the Hauma rituals, a sacred drink used by priests and spiritual seekers to induce visions. Scholars still debate what the actual ingredients were. Some say cannabis, others say ephedra or poppy. Maybe it was a whole cocktail of cosmic plant power, but the idea is the same. Altered consciousness as a doorway to the divine. And this is where the academic debates get loud. Did the Greeks knowingly use cannabis for psychoactive effects? Or were they just importing it for rope and oil and accidentally catching a contact high at the odd funeral? There's no smoking gun, or smoking scroll as it were. Some say cannabis was strictly medicinal or industrial. Others argue that, like wine, it had a place in social or religious life, but people were just too classy to admit it outright. You're now sitting on a sun-warmed step outside a whitewashed building. A philosopher is giving a lecture nearby about the nature of virtue, but half the audience is drowsy, and the other half is distracted by the rising scent of something familiar. You glance at a nearby student unrolling a twist of dried leaves into a small clay pipe. He lights it, inhales, and then stares at the sky like he's seeing it for the first time. You ask yourself, does it matter if they called it cannabis, or if they admitted to its effects? The practice is there, the smoke, the leaves, the whispers between friends at dusk. In this Mediterranean sun, nothing is written in neon, but it's scrawled in the margins, tucked between the olive oil jugs and the half-remembered poems. The Greeks didn't need to announce it. They just passed it quietly, like an afterthought. Like something too old to be new, too sacred to be scandalous. You lean back. The white stones are warm beneath you. Somewhere nearby, a lyre plays a soft, meandering tune. The air smells like the past. Faintly smoky, vaguely floral, and always just out of reach. The white marble of the Greek world fades behind you, and the sun begins to lower, stretching shadows across arid hills and long rivers. You ride the breeze eastward, through golden deserts, and the domes of ancient cities glinting under the sun, until you arrive in the heart of the Islamic Golden Age. It's the 9th century now, somewhere between Baghdad, Cairo, and Samarkand, and everything smells like honey, parchment, and saffron. You're in a world of scholars, mystics, and poets, where knowledge flows like water through the canals of civilization. And tucked into the corners of this intellectual bloom, hashish. Yeah, the good stuff. Hashish isn't new by this point, but here it's reaching something close to legendary status. While cannabis flowers had been smoked or brewed into drinks in other parts of the world, here they're being concentrated. You've gone from leafy tea to resinous paste, sticky, dark, and potent. Hashish is made by separating the trichomes from the cannabis plant and compressing them, kind of like if you took all the sparkle and weirdness of the plant and concentrated it into a cube. It's the espresso of ancient highs. You're wandering now through a shaded courtyard in Baghdad. It's quiet, save for the soft trickle of a fountain and the distant chanting of a muezzin. A few scholars sit cross-legged on cushions discussing geometry and the movement of stars. Nearby, 2 men pass a small lump of hashish between them, not smoked, eaten, mixed into honey or wrapped in dates. One of them giggles softly and loses his place mid-sentence. No one seems to mind, and that's the thing. While alcohol was banned in Islamic societies due to religious law, cannabis, and especially hashish, slipped through the cracks. It wasn't exactly endorsed, but it wasn't always forbidden either. For many it was a loophole, for others a medicine. And for some, especially the Sufis, it was a path to the divine. You find yourself drawn into a small Sufi gathering. There's chanting, rhythm, dancing, breathwork, the kind of spiritual practice that aims to strip away the ego and find union with God. And for some Sufis, cannabis played a role in that search. Taken in small amounts, it was seen as a tool to open perception, quiet the mind, and deepen meditation. You're offered a bite of a sweet hashish confection. You chew slowly as music swirls around you. It's not about escape, it's about expansion. But not everyone was thrilled with the rise of hashish. The more orthodox thinkers saw it as a threat to social order, a distraction from piety and responsibility. Over time, edicts were issued. Hashish was banned, unbanned, rebanned. Penalties range from lashes to exile to being shamed in a poem, possibly the worst fate in a literary age. And here's your quirky fact. The word assassin might come from the Arabic hashashin, a term allegedly used for a secretive sect of Nizari Ismailis who were said to use hashish before carrying out political murders. Now, modern scholars are very divided on this. Some say it's total myth, Islamophobic slander dreamed up by crusaders and European chroniclers who couldn't believe anyone would kill for ideology alone. Others argue that there was a ritual use of hashish among the group, just not quite in the Hollywood slow-motion murder kind of way. But either way, the connection stuck. Hashish became both mystical and menacing in the cultural imagination. In some tales, it was the drug of prophets and poets. In others, it was the whisper of chaos and rebellion. You can feel both stories living in the air here, in the quiet gardens where mystics sit in stillness, and in the alleyways where less spiritual types laugh a little too loudly after their hashish has kicked in. And that's where the scholarly debate gets thorny. Was cannabis accepted in Islamic societies, or tolerated quietly in backrooms and fringe sects? Did its medicinal use shield it from condemnation, or did it just ride under the radar thanks to the lack of strong intoxicating smell compared to alcohol? Some argue that hashish culture was central to the Islamic world's artistic and mystical traditions. Others say it was always on the margins, always a little scandalous, always one poet away from being outlawed again. You walk through a narrow street lit by oil lamps. The walls are painted with verse. Poets here don't just rhyme, they shimmer. You pass a man leaning against a doorway reciting, "Smoke of hashish, veil of delight, unbinds the soul, sets fire to night." He winks at you. Is it poetry or prophecy? Maybe both. As the night deepens, you sit down near the Tigris River. The stars are sharp tonight, pinpricks of light spread across a velvet sky. Someone nearby plays a stringed instrument, the melody soft and repetitive. You nibble the last bit of hashish-laced honey from earlier, and a calm clarity washes over you. This isn't wild or chaotic, it's slow, intentional. There's a reason mystics embraced this, and yet you know it wouldn't last forever. Politics shift, empires rise and fall, attitudes toward cannabis would continue to swing wildly across the centuries. But here, in this moment, you're at a crossroads. Between medicine and mysticism, between science and story, between the forbidden and the sacred. The breeze off the river is cool, you lie back, eyes drifting toward the stars, and in that stillness, you start to understand why some believed cannabis wasn't just a plant. It was a messenger. Morning creeps up again, gold and soft, and the Tigris slips away behind you like a dream. The call to prayer fades into the horizon, replaced by something drier, dustier, more ancient. You find yourself in North Africa now, close to the Nile, with the scent of date palms and warm stone thick in the air. You're heading into another chapter of cannabis history that doesn't get nearly enough airtime. Because while the classical world and the Islamic Golden Age were tossing the plant between medicine and mysticism, Africa, especially parts of East and Central Africa, was quietly developing its own relationship with cannabis. It just took a bit longer for the smoke to show. You're walking through a village that hugs the Nile, and it's not modern Egypt yet. This is old. Like pyramids old, pharaohs old. But here's the thing. Despite all the grand architecture, the civilization, the detailed records carved into walls, Egypt's relationship with cannabis is murky, like suspiciously quiet, and that in itself is fascinating. You peek into an ancient apothecary's corner where shelves are stacked with oils and dried herbs. Papyrus scrolls flutter in the breeze like sleepy flags. One of them mentions shemshemet, a word some scholars believe could mean cannabis. The Egyptians had hundreds of plants catalogued for healing: aloe, lotus, frankincense. But cannabis? It gets just a whisper, a maybe, a parenthetical footnote in a tomb full of bold headlines. So here's your first open question of the night. Why didn't cannabis have a louder presence in ancient Egyptian medicine, especially when the region clearly had access to the plant? Was it culturally undervalued? Used in a way that didn't warrant documentation? Or were the historians just more interested in scarabs and eyeliner recipes? Fast forward a bit and suddenly the silence lifts. You're moving south, across the Sahara, and into sub-Saharan Africa, where cannabis starts showing up in real, tangible, smokable ways. It arrives in the region from multiple directions, through Arab traders from the northeast, Indian Ocean sailors from the east, and possibly even from early contact with Asia via long-lost land routes. However it got there, it took root, and not just in soil, in culture. You're standing in a small village in Central Africa now, sometime in the early centuries CE, and the air smells distinctly herbal. Someone's cooking porridge over a fire and a small group of men sit in a circle, passing around a long wooden pipe carved with animal faces. The laughter is low and frequent, like waves breaking in slow motion. Cannabis here becomes a social lubricant, a ritual ingredient, a healer. It's not industrialized like in ancient China, not as religiously codified as in India. Instead, it's woven into everyday life, used in coming-of-age ceremonies, medicinal brews, and quiet evening smokes after a day of farming under a ruthless sun. And here's your quirky fact. In some African traditions, cannabis was thought to protect people from evil spirits, or enhance communication with ancestors. There are oral histories where cannabis smoke is used to awaken memory during funerals, like opening a mental doorway between the living and the dead. You can almost see it, the smoke rising into the night, curling upward like a ladder of thought. The method of use here is different too. Pipes dominate, not rolled leaves or sweet drinks. These are carved from wood, clay, and sometimes bone. You hold one in your hands now, warm from the fire, smooth where 1,000 fingers have passed it. The bowl is packed tightly. You can smell the smoke before it even reaches your mouth. Earthy, dense, like the land itself. And here comes the scholarly argument. Was cannabis native to Africa or entirely imported? Some believe wild varieties existed across parts of the continent long before historical documentation, while others insist that cannabis was introduced and only later adopted and cultivated. It's one of those ongoing archaeological debates with no clear winner, just bits of pollen, half-burned seeds, and thousands of years of smoke lost to the wind. You drift west, through centuries and shifting borders, until you reach the coastal regions of Angola and Congo. Portuguese traders are arriving now, their ships fat with spices, ivory, and grimly enslaved people. But there's another layer to this history, one that isn't carved into textbooks as often as it should be. Enslaved Africans brought their knowledge of cannabis with them to the Americas. It travelled not just in sacks and bundles, but in memory, practice, and ritual. On some plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, enslaved Africans grew cannabis secretly in garden plots, smoked it in hidden circles, and passed down songs and stories wrapped in its haze. Colonial authorities noticed. They weren't fans. As early as the 18th century, laws were put in place forbidding enslaved people from smoking cannabis, calling it a corrupting influence, a threat to obedience. And now you're standing at the edge of a field in colonial Saint-Domingue, future Haiti, watching a woman crush dried cannabis leaves into a paste and mix it with herbs to rub into a child's aching leg. She doesn't call it medicine, she just knows it works. There's no label, no dosage, no Latin name, just tradition, passed through time like a living map. You start to realise something deeper. Cannabis in Africa wasn't just a plant. It was survival, comfort, resistance. Whether as a medicine, a spiritual guide, or a quiet form of rebellion, it rooted itself in communities where it was needed most. And when it moved across oceans, it carried stories. Back under the wide African sky, stars blinking to life one by one, you sit near a cooking fire. Someone passes the pipe again. The night is quiet but full. You take a slow breath in and feel it. Not just the smoke, but the weight of history, the warmth of memory, the buzz of a plant that has always meant more than it seems. You blink and the stars rearrange. The campfire dims, replaced by the glow of stained glass windows and flickering candlelight. Welcome to medieval Europe, where the air smells like damp stone, boiled cabbage, and a mild hint of plague. Things are a little stiff here. People are bundled in wool, superstition is thicker than the fog rolling over the moors, and you're pretty sure someone nearby just accused their neighbour of being a witch because their bread rose too fast. It's not exactly a prime time for herbal experimentation, but that doesn't mean cannabis vanished. It just went incognito. You find yourself in a walled village surrounded by fields. A woman stoops in her garden, her fingers busy with a tall, wiry plant. Fibrous, leafy, clearly useful. It's hemp. Cannabis sativa, but the industrial kind. Low in THC, high in practical ambition. This plant isn't for partying. It's for ropes, sails, cloth, and probably the monk's itchy robe. You touch one of the stalks. Coarse, strong, and oddly dignified. Hemp was Europe's favourite plant nobody wanted to talk about at dinner. And here's where you really start to feel the shift. For centuries in Europe, cannabis was basically demoted to a blue-collar worker. No more spiritual reverence, no poetic odes. Just rope, textiles, a bit of medicinal use if you had a literate monk nearby. You walk into a monastery and sure enough, tucked between shelves of dried mint and chamomile, there's a jar labelled cannabis. It's not flashy, but it's there. Used in poultices, sometimes in teas, maybe to treat inflammation or assist with childbirth, and always wrapped in the kind of clinical language that makes it sound more like a tax form than a plant. Here's your quirky fact. Medieval herbalists sometimes included cannabis in recipes to treat what they delicately called female issues, a broad term that covered everything from cramps to mood swings to the unspeakable horror of menopause. These treatments were handed down through grimoires, many of which read like a cross between a cookbook and a cryptic threat. One recipe calls for cannabis steeped in goat's milk and blessed 3 times under a full moon. So, pretty normal stuff. But you also notice that the farther you travel from the monastery, the looser the rules become. In rural areas, cannabis grows wild along paths and fields. Peasants, who had no formal medical training but plenty of common sense, use the leaves in homemade salves or toss them into fires to mask the smell of whatever died behind the barn last week. Some even start noticing that inhaling the smoke makes you relaxed, just a little more patient with your ox. Still, there's a major buzzkill looming over all this: the church. While cannabis isn't explicitly condemned, the general attitude toward altered states is chilly at best and heretical at worst. Anything that shifted perception, that let you see beyond the accepted reality, could land you a starring role in your own personal witch trial. Spiritual highs weren't in fashion unless they came with incense and Latin. But here's where the scholarly arguments flare up like a chimney fire. Some historians claim cannabis was quietly used as a psychoactive in certain folk rituals across Europe, especially in Slavic and Baltic regions. Others say there's no solid evidence and that it was strictly industrial or medicinal. One camp points to old recipes and folk songs hinting at herbs that open the mind. The other camp rolls their eyes and demands chemical residue. Honestly, they're both probably right. You can almost see it. A farmer's wife tossing a handful of dried leaves into the fire, watching her husband get oddly philosophical after dinner, and then just deciding not to mention it to the priest. You step into a bustling medieval port town now, somewhere along the Mediterranean coast. Traders from across the known world are docking, unloading spices, silk, and yes, cannabis products. Not leafy weed, but fibre and oil. European rope makers and textile mills are thriving on hemp imports, and while nobody's passing joints on the docks, the plant is moving, quietly weaving its way into the sails that push ships across the sea. One of those ships you realise is bound for the New World, but we'll save that for later. Back on land, you pass a tavern. Inside, the beer is warm, the stew is suspicious, and the conversation is mostly grumbling. But in the corner, an old woman is holding court, telling a story about a healer who used green smoke to calm a possessed man. Everyone laughs, nervously. You look closer, and there's a bundle of dried leaves tucked into the rafters above her head. Maybe they're just herbs for stew, or maybe not. The truth is, cannabis in medieval Europe was less about revolution and more about utility. No grand rituals, no ecstatic visions, just quiet usefulness. It patched sails, made rope for cathedrals, softened childbirth, and maybe, just maybe, helped a few overworked farmers feel like the world wasn't pressing quite so hard on their shoulders. You sit down in a field at the edge of the village watching the hemp sway in the breeze. It's not glamorous. It's not wild. But there's something beautiful about its steadiness. The way it just shows up, century after century, doing its job, waiting for someone to really see it again. The hemp fields ripple one last time before they dissolve, and just like that, you're airborne again. Only this time, you're crossing an entire ocean. Below you, dense forests stretch across the Americas, interrupted by winding rivers and smoke from distant fires. It's the pre-Columbian world now, before galleons, gold fever, and European discoveries. You're landing among civilizations that rose high on pyramids and maize, in a hemisphere where cannabis has not yet put down roots. At least not the ones you know. You're in the thick of a Maya settlement now, and the first thing you notice is how green everything is. Jungle vines curling around temples, fruit trees dripping with colour, the air heavy with humidity and a symphony of insects. The Maya are busy, carving glyphs, charting the stars and perfecting chocolate. But cannabis? Not in sight. You ask around, politely, invisibly, and the herbalists hand you bundles of bark, flowers, seeds. But none of them are cannabis sativa. Because here's the twist. Cannabis is an old world plant. It didn't exist in the Americas before European contact. No one in pre-Columbian Mexico or Peru or the Pacific Northwest was puffing on joints, mixing bang, or weaving hemp sandals. It just wasn't here. The land had its own botanical toolbox: tobacco, peyote, yopo, psilocybin mushrooms, and ayahuasca. And make no mistake, these cultures knew how to explore consciousness. They had their own sacred plants, rituals, and deep cosmologies around altered states. They just didn't have weed. You sit cross-legged inside a ceremonial hut, watching as a shaman prepares a tobacco blend so potent it could probably knock out a mule. The smoke is blown through a hollow reed into a young initiate's nose, and the effect is immediate. His eyes roll back, his breathing slows, and the ceremony begins. There's chanting, drumming, visions. This is not your cousin's vape pen in the backyard. This is pharmacological teleportation, and still no cannabis in sight. Here's your quirky fact. While cannabis didn't make it to the Americas until after 1492, some researchers believe that the Americas' native entheogens shaped the idea of spiritual plants globally. European explorers, upon encountering these rituals, began reassessing the plants they'd always taken for granted. It's not that the Americas needed cannabis. It's that their relationship with nature was already so rich and complex that it expanded what plants could mean everywhere else. Now fast forward a few hundred years, the boats have arrived. Guns, germs, and steel are rewriting entire civilizations. Alongside them, seeds. Lots of seeds. Wheat, barley, sugarcane, and cannabis. You watch as European settlers and colonial powers begin planting hemp across North and South America. But again, it's not the fun kind. It's industrial. Rope for ships, cloth for sails, tough fibres for all the empire's business. In British colonies like Jamestown, hemp is practically mandatory. Laws are passed requiring farmers to grow it. You walk through rows of tall, skinny plants waving under a Carolina sun. Impressive, but utterly unsmokable. THC, barely a whisper. You pluck a leaf and chew it. Nothing happens except your mouth gets dry and you start to seriously rethink your life choices. And yet, something's happening under the surface. While European settlers are all about hemp as material, enslaved Africans, brought violently across the ocean, carry with them knowledge of cannabis as medicine, ritual, and release. In Brazil, in the Caribbean, and eventually in the American South, cannabis begins to reappear in its older, more potent forms, not because of colonial science, but because of cultural memory. You step into a makeshift garden behind a small cabin. A woman is crushing leaves and flowers into a paste, not unlike what you saw in Central Africa. She applies it to a man's sore joints, humming as she works. No one taught her that here. She brought it with her. That's the thing. Cannabis didn't naturally spread to the Americas. It was carried, deliberately, sometimes secretly, sometimes violently. And that means its early use in the New World was fragmented, coded, and deeply shaped by race, power, and resistance. While European colonists viewed it as rope, others saw it as relief, escape, prayer, a piece of home in a world turned upside down. You stroll into a Haitian village now, decades later. The revolution has happened, and free black communities are rebuilding their lives. You see cannabis again, being smoked casually in the evening, the way others sip wine. No fanfare, no sermons, just rhythm and ritual. A slow exhale against a long day. Of course, this is where the record gets blurry. Most colonial documents ignore or suppress these practices. Cannabis doesn't make it into many ledgers, except as a footnote in plantation inventories or in the warnings of nervous clergymen. But the silence doesn't mean it wasn't there. It just means you have to look harder at the stories passed down, the songs, the patterns of planting and use. And here comes the scholarly debate. When exactly did psychoactive cannabis, not hemp, take hold in the Americas? Was it smuggled in by enslaved people? Brought later by Indian labourers after slavery was abolished? Did it evolve in secret gardens or pop up once wild strains began adapting to their new environment? No one fully agrees. It's all theories, pollen samples and educated guesses. But the signs are there, like smoke on the wind. You're walking now through a sugarcane field at dusk. The day's work is done, and a small group sits together, sharing food, stories, and something wrapped in a corn husk. The smoke drifts upward. It's soft, slow, nothing flashy. But you can tell it's not just tobacco, and it's not just habit. It's culture, being carried forward one breath at a time. Cannabis in the pre-modern Americas wasn't loud. It wasn't legal, but it was alive, growing in secret, rooting in places history forgot to look. The smoke clears and the sugarcane disappears behind you, replaced by tricorn hats, starched collars, and a smell in the air that can only be described as old-timey body odour with a hint of molasses. Welcome to the 17th and 18th centuries, colonial times, the age of empire, the era of fancy wigs and terrible ideas. You're now fully in the new world, but everything is still wearing an old world outfit. And cannabis? Oh, it's here. Just not in the way you're hoping. You're walking along a dirt road in Virginia, and you don't have to look far to find hemp fields. They're everywhere, mandated by law in some places. George Washington himself grew hemp at Mount Vernon, not as a side hustle for mellow vibes, but because every decent landowner knew you needed rope, sailcloth, and sturdy canvas. This plant was functional, dependable, about as exciting to the colonial gentry as a sack of potatoes, except with more paperwork. You wander into one of these fields, brushing your fingers against the rough, fibrous stalks. The plants tower over you, not lush and fragrant like today's boutique cannabis strains, but wiry, rigid, and extremely disinterested in your spiritual journey. These are hemp workhorses, bred for strength, not softness. If you're hoping for a buzz, you're going to be sorely disappointed and probably a little itchy. Back in the town square, you overhear a conversation. A merchant is complaining about a shipment of hemp twine that got wet in the hold and moulded. Another man suggests switching to flax, and suddenly you're deep in a colonial argument about cordage. You slowly back away, realizing no one here is thinking about cannabis as anything other than rope. There are no pipes, no ceremonies, no lounges with velvet cushions, just utility. But here's where things start to get weird, because while the upper crust is fixated on fibre, the lower classes and enslaved people might have had a very different view. You find yourself in a small outbuilding behind a plantation house. A man is grinding leaves with a stone, mixing them with fat to make a salve for sore muscles. He doesn't call it medicine. He doesn't call it anything. It's just something you do. Passed down, remembered, used. In the Caribbean, it's a little louder. You drift to Jamaica in the late 1600s and find a bustling colonial port. Merchants from Britain, slaves from Africa, labourers from India, all packed together in a chaotic, salty stew of trade and exploitation. And there, hidden among the sugarcane and rum barrels, are the first flickers of cannabis use for something other than sales. Indian indentured servants, brought to the Caribbean in the 19th century but whose roots are forming even earlier in the cultural soil, carry with them a plant they call ganja, and they don't just grow it, they use it, smoked in pipes, chewed, steeped in teas, not for rope, not for cloth, but for calm, for meditation, for relief. You sit by a campfire with them as the sun drops below the palm trees. The pipe passes slowly, and the conversation drifts with it. Quiet chuckles, eyes half-lidded, a calm born not from intoxication, but from something gentler. It's not about checking out, it's about staying sane in a system designed to break you. And here's your quirky fact. While colonial governments were obsessed with taxing rum, controlling opium, and stamping out any form of dissent, cannabis, low-profile, humble cannabis, was often ignored. It slipped through the cracks, quiet, unregulated, treated as nothing more than a regional habit, a poor man's pastime. But cracks eventually get noticed, and by the late 18th century, European doctors are starting to catch on, not to smoking weed, but to using it in tinctures and tonics. You peek into a dusty apothecary shop in London. The shelves are lined with brown bottles labelled in precise curly script. Cannabis extract, for neuralgia, spasms, hysteria. You read the ingredients. Alcohol, cannabis resin, laudanum, a sprinkle of Victorian optimism. Doctors begin to write long-winded case studies about the calming effects of cannabis. Queen Victoria's personal physician even recommends it for menstrual cramps. And this is where the scholarly debate ignites. Was cannabis actually common in colonial medicine, or just a fashionable fad among the elite? Was it quietly used among enslaved communities and servants long before the doctors got curious? And how much did empire play a role in shaping the image of the plant? Not just what it was, but who was allowed to use it? You move through a colonial port city, maybe Boston, maybe Charleston, and notice a pattern. Hemp mills, shipyards, rope walks stretching hundreds of feet, and just beyond them, tucked away behind market stalls and stables, are tiny backyard plots. Some wild, some intentional, all growing something that looks just a little too leafy to be lettuce. Cannabis in colonial America was a split personality. On the surface, it was practical, mandatory, utterly boring. But underneath, especially in marginalised communities, it was something else. Something older, familiar, unspoken. It wasn't front and centre yet, but it was waiting in the wings, ready to step back into the spotlight once the rope business started to fray. And that's the thing about history. It's not just about what's written down. It's about what's remembered in kitchens, whispered over fences, grown in the margins. While the founding fathers were busy crafting hemp laws and printing on hemp paper, someone in a nearby shack was rolling a leaf between their fingers, lighting it, and watching the smoke curl up into the rafters. Not because it was trendy, not because it was medical, but because it felt right. You sit down on a crate near the docks, the salty air stinging your face. Above you, sails made of hemp billow in the breeze. Ships creak and groan, bound for other shores. And somewhere nearby, someone lights something small and green and takes a slow, thoughtful drag. The harbour wind fades, and so do the wigs and waistcoats. You're shifting again, this time to the end of the 18th century, just as empires are flexing their muscles in places they don't belong. You land on the banks of the Nile, but it's not pharaonic Egypt anymore. It's French-occupied Egypt. Yes, that's right. Napoleon is here, dragging with him not only soldiers and cannons, but a full entourage of scientists, artists, and professional buzzkills. It's hot, chaotic, and full of the kind of uncomfortable colonial energy that makes you want to stand politely behind a palm tree and observe from a distance. The year is 1798, and Napoleon's campaign in Egypt is a whole fever dream of conquest and confusion. You're walking through a busy Cairo street, dodging camels, carts, and the thick smell of spice and sweat. And then you catch a whiff of something else. It's earthy, sweet, smoky. You follow it to a narrow alley where a group of locals is sitting in a smoky tea house, puffing slowly on long-necked pipes and laughing like they just heard the funniest joke in a decade. You don't know the language, but you know the vibe. This is hashish. The French soldiers do too. At first, they're just observing, same as you, but it's not long before curiosity wins out. Alcohol is scarce. Napoleon banned it for the troops, and hashish starts looking like a pretty appealing substitute. Soon soldiers are seen lounging in cafes, giggling in tents, and maybe spacing out a little too hard on patrol. The military brass is not amused. Hashish is declared off limits. The order is clear: no smoking, eating, or drinking cannabis in any form. Naturally, everyone ignores it, and that's your quirky fact. Napoleon's army might have been the first Western military force to experience widespread cannabis use among its troops, and then panic about it. Soldiers returning home brought stories and possibly samples back to France. Hashish entered Europe not through trade or science, but through war, through a dusty, accidental run-in with a culture that had been using it for centuries, while the Europeans were still too busy sewing buttons onto stockings. Now you're drifting back to Paris, early 1800s. The revolution is over, sort of, and the city is deep in a new obsession. Orientalism. Everything vaguely Middle Eastern is fashionable. Scarves, tea, scimitars, and yes, hashish. Not just any hashish, though. This is the stuff of legend, wrapped in exoticism and sprinkled with dramatic flair. You're now inside a dimly lit salon, seated cross-legged among writers, artists and philosophers, with extremely dramatic facial hair. This is the Club des Hashichins, the club of the hashish eaters. This real-life group met throughout the mid-1800s in Paris, using hashish as a kind of artistic fuel. They didn't just nibble it, they played it. Hashish was often consumed as dawamesque, a jam-like mixture of cannabis, pistachio, cinnamon, nutmeg and rosewater. They'd eat a spoonful, then wait as the walls started to melt and their minds flung open like creaky old windows. Gustave Flaubert, Charles Baudelaire, Victor Hugo, they all dipped in at some point. Some were intrigued, some were terrified. One man allegedly believed he had turned into a glass of water and was too afraid to move, lest he spill. Meanwhile, European scientists, always a few steps behind, began to study cannabis in earnest. French psychiatrist Jacques-Joseph Moreau observed its effects with clinical fascination. He believed hashish could help unlock the secrets of mental illness. Not cure it exactly, just illuminate it. He experimented on himself, on his students, probably on anyone who wasn't fast enough to leave the room. He wrote that hashish adds something of the marvellous to every impression, which sounds poetic, and also a little like the last thing you'd want your psychiatrist to say before handing you a spoonful of glowing jam. And here's the debate that still lingers. Were these artists and doctors actually advancing science, or were they just getting really poetic while very high? Some historians argue that this was the beginning of cannabis being framed as a mind-expanding substance in Western culture. Others say it was just the recreational tourism of privileged men dabbling in something they didn't fully understand, exoticizing it for entertainment. The truth probably lives somewhere between the jam jar and the velvet drapes. But back to Egypt for a moment, because while the French left, hashish never did. In fact, cannabis use in Egypt expanded after Napoleon's retreat. It became a central part of daily life for many, especially in rural and working-class communities. In Cairo, you could find hashish dens, street vendors selling pre-rolled joints, and doctors quietly prescribing it for everything from headaches to heartbreaks. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't controversial. It just was. Until, of course, the British showed up. You feel it before you see it. The tightening, the bureaucratic itch, the colonial fear of anything that made people too happy, too relaxed, too unbothered by empire. British authorities, following their tried-and-true policy of meddling in other people's peace, began cracking down on hashish across their colonies, India, Egypt, and beyond. They called it dangerous, immoral, a threat to productivity, which, if you read between the lines, basically means too many brown people are enjoying this without our permission. But for now, here in this narrow alley in Cairo, a man leans back on a woven mat, exhales a ribbon of smoke, and closes his eyes. You sit beside him, the pipe warm in your hand. Outside, the sun sinks below the buildings and the city hums. There's no revolution, no war, just a long inhale and a pause that feels like the whole world letting out a sigh. The sigh fades, and with it the alleys of Cairo blur into foggy streets and horse-drawn carriages. You're in London now, and everything smells like coal smoke, wet wool, and ambition. The year is somewhere in the 1840s, and the Industrial Revolution is chugging along like a soot-covered train no one can stop. Chimneys rise like fingers of warning, chiming clocks ring out across gaslit avenues, and if you listen closely you can hear the sound of a nation proudly ignoring how tired it is. But tucked behind all this productivity, a quiet little cannabis tea party. Welcome to the Victorian era, the age of powdered wigs, social anxiety and long-winded medical treatises. You walk past the stiff collars and tight corsets, right into the back room of an apothecary where things are, well, looser. Here, cannabis isn't something to be smoked in alleyways. It's packaged in fine glass bottles, prescribed by doctors, and sipped delicately from porcelain cups. If hashish in Cairo was about laughter and rebellion, Cannabis in Victorian England is about relief, especially from being alive in the 19th century, which seems like a constant battle against drafts, damp shoes, and unexplained sadness. You peer over the pharmacist's shoulder as he measures out a thick golden tincture. It's cannabis extract suspended in alcohol, branded with elegant typography and impossible promises. Soothes nervous disorders, relieves melancholia, cures hysteria. If it sounds like snake oil, that's because it basically is, but with just enough science to keep everyone comfortable. Victorian medicine was obsessed with tonics, elixirs, and the delicate balance of bodily humours. If you were anxious, insomniac, depressed, or just bored with your knitting, cannabis was quietly there for you. But you won't find anyone calling it weed. It's Indian hemp now, a name that adds a dash of colonial flair and exotic distance. Doctors like William O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician who studied in India, began introducing cannabis to British medicine with all the confidence of someone who just read a half-translated text and decided it was good enough for publication. O'Shaughnessy tested cannabis on everything from epilepsy to tetanus and returned to England with glowing reports and a pocket full of samples. Boom, Victorian cannabis goes mainstream. And here's your quirky fact. Cannabis was not only used to calm nerves but also given to children. Teething powders, cough syrups. Yes, cannabis for kids. In small doses, of course, but still, imagine dosing your toddler with a tincture made from plants now banned in half the world. 19th century parenting, where every solution was equal parts terrifying and soothing. Now, before you assume everyone was just gracefully floating around on cannabis clouds, it's worth noting how the drug's popularity was shaped by class. Middle and upper class Victorians consumed cannabis in refined ways. Drops in tea, candy lozenges, discreet powders. Meanwhile, working class users were more likely to encounter it in fringe herbal markets, sometimes mixed with opium or alcohol. And as always, perception varied by who was using it and how loudly. That's where the debate starts crackling beneath your boots. Historians still argue over how widespread cannabis use really was in 19th century England. Some claim it was everywhere, tucked into medicine cabinets, pressed into patent remedies, served up in every pharmacy worth its salt. Others say it was niche, limited to a curious few and mostly forgotten once stronger, faster-acting drugs like morphine and cocaine stole the spotlight. Cannabis didn't knock you out. It just made the day feel a little softer around the edges, which wasn't quite on brand for the Victorian obsession with dramatic transformation. But there was something else happening under the surface. Stories. British writers and artists started flirting with the exotic imagery associated with cannabis and hashish. You drift into a smoky sitting room now, and a young woman is reading The Hashish Eater, a wildly dramatic memoir by American writer Fitzhugh Ludlow. He waxes poetic about eating hashish, experiencing astral projection, and touching the outer edges of human consciousness. Her eyes are wide, she folds the page. Maybe she'll try it. Or maybe she'll just keep imagining. It's a familiar cycle. Someone brings cannabis from somewhere else, wraps it in mystery, and sells it as a bridge to a more interesting life. Never mind that the people who originally used it didn't need a bridge. But the Victorians, bless them, loved a good mystic escape wrapped in polite language. Cannabis became a sort of drawing room dare, a curious little indulgence whispered about at parties, and tried just once, maybe twice, under supervision. And then, as quickly as it bloomed, it began to dim. By the late 19th century, cannabis was already being edged out by newer, flashier substances. The British pharmaceutical industry began favouring morphine, codeine and barbiturates, drugs that came with cleaner patents and stronger kicks. Plus, cannabis had a branding problem. You couldn't quite predict it. Some people felt calm, others got the giggles, and a few just passed out in their embroidery. Not exactly textbook medicine. The stage is already being set for cannabis to fall out of favour. You see it in the medical journals, where once praised treatments become footnotes. You see it in legislation starting to creep into colonial rule, concern about Indian workers smoking too much ganja, or Egyptian locals wasting their days in hashish cafes. In Britain itself, attitudes are cooling. Too unpredictable, too foreign, too hard to control. You sit now in a small garden, fog thick around you, the teacup in your hand still warm from the cannabis tincture someone swore would help with your persistent nerves. It hasn't changed your life, but the tightness in your chest has eased. The world feels a little less sharp. You listen as church bells chime the hour, and a train whistles in the distance. Somewhere nearby, a mother gives her child a few drops of the same medicine. A writer paces her parlour, thinking about India. A doctor marks a prescription with a quick flick of his pen. None of them know what's coming. The plant they're using quietly, legally, almost casually, is about to become one of the most controversial substances in the modern world, but for now it's just part of the background. Just another remedy on the shelf, still wrapped in mystery, still balancing on the edge of magic and medicine. The teacup trembles slightly in your hand as the fog begins to thicken, and then it lifts, quickly, sharply, like someone yanking open a curtain. You're hit with the blare of brass instruments, the slap of a snare drum, and a low, sultry trumpet moan that winds through the night like smoke through a keyhole. Welcome to the 1920s. The jazz is hot, the drinks are hidden, and the weed? It's finally here to party. You're standing under the flickering neon of a speakeasy sign in New Orleans. The street glistens from a recent rain, and people are crowding into a dim-lit club where the air is thick with sweat, perfume, cigarette smoke, and, yes, cannabis. Lots of it. It's not legal, of course, but neither is the gin being passed under tables and teacups. This is Prohibition-era America, where everything fun is technically forbidden, and everyone's doing it anyway. You step inside and the sound hits you like a wave. Piano keys ricochet off the walls, a stand-up bass thumps in the corner, and the horn section blasts like it's trying to shake God awake. And there, in the back corner booth, are the musicians, bent over, laughing, passing a joint from hand to hand like a cigarette rolled too thick and burning a little unevenly. They call it muggles, reefer, tea, grass, gauge, Mary Jane. The slang is endless, and every city's got its own vocabulary. But the meaning is always the same. Jazz and cannabis go together like melody and groove. You slide into the booth. Someone nods at you, passes the joint. It smells sharp, peppery, alive. You take a hit. Cough, of course, and settle into the rhythm. Everything stretches. The music hits deeper. Notes that were just noise a moment ago now feel like secrets being whispered into your bloodstream. This is where the cannabis story takes a turn. No longer hidden in apothecaries or folk remedies, it's part of a living, pulsing culture. Jazz musicians across New Orleans, Chicago, Kansas City and Harlem are lighting up before, during and after performances. It's not just about getting high, it's about breaking patterns, about seeing music from a new angle, feeling rhythm without rules. Louis Armstrong, yes, that Louis Armstrong was a devoted cannabis user. He even called it the gauge, and credited it for smoothing out his playing and keeping him grounded. And here's your quirky fact. Armstrong was once arrested for smoking weed outside a club in Los Angeles. The cops didn't know who he was at the time. He served a short sentence, and later joked that he and the arresting officer became friends. As far as stoner origin stories go, Louis Armstrong got busted for lighting up between trumpet solos is hard to beat. But with the buzz came backlash. Cannabis was still associated with Mexican immigrants and black jazz musicians, two groups America wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for. As cannabis crept into cities alongside culture, it also stirred up the same tired fears. Moral panic, corruption, the idea that people were using it to escape, or worse, influence others. This is where the scholarly debate simmers like a backroom argument. Did cannabis fuel creativity? Or did it simply offer relief from relentless racism and systemic pressure? Was it a musical muse or a coping mechanism? The answer, as always, is both. Artists smoked to feel freer, yes, but also to keep going. In a world that offered them few rights, cannabis offered a kind of sanctuary, a brief, buzzing room in the mind where no one could kick them out. You walk through Harlem now, past the Apollo Theatre and into a Harlem Renaissance salon, where writers are reading poetry laced with rhythm and rage. Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, some tried it, some didn't, but the scent of cannabis hangs in the background like a jazz note bending in midair. The air is alive with music, ideas, defiance, and cannabis is woven through it all, not the focus, but always close by, like a silent partner in the revolution. Meanwhile, newspapers start sharpening their pens. Reefer madness isn't a meme yet, it's the mood. Sensational headlines warn of youths corrupted, women seduced, and marijuana turning mild-mannered men into murderous lunatics. Spoiler, it's all nonsense, a tangle of racism, moral panic, an anti-immigrant sentiment wrapped in bad science and worse journalism. But it's effective. Public opinion begins to turn, and where opinion goes, laws soon follow, but not yet. Here in the 1920s, cannabis still breathes easy in the undercurrent. It's not mainstream, but it's everywhere. In music, in dance halls, in the secret jokes between musicians. You find yourself at a backyard gathering in Kansas City, a barbecue pit smoking beside a record player crackling out a Benny Moten tune. Someone hands you a hand-rolled cigarette. You don't ask what's in it. You already know. And here's the quieter truth of this era. For many people, cannabis was not just a party favour. It was a breath, a break, a way to reclaim a moment of joy in a world that offered very few. In neighbourhoods weighed down by segregation and poverty, it offered laughter, lightness, even if just for an hour. You sit beneath a fire escape now, the city humming around you. Above, a man leans out his window, blowing slow smoke rings into the Harlem night. The reefer's almost burned down, but the rhythm, it keeps going. The beat doesn't stop. You close your eyes and let it ride. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others. Yes, that's a real sentiment, lifted from the bureaucratic brain of a man with too much power and a personal vendetta. It wasn't just about the plant, it was about the people. Anslinger weaponized racism, classism, and fear, mixing them into a thick moral syrup he poured over the entire country. You walk through a theatre where jazz once poured out the windows and find it shuttered now, its posters replaced with ominous public service announcements. Marijuana. The devil's weed. Weed with roots in hell. They've swapped out the trumpet for trembling violins and women screaming into mirrors. In the 1936 cult classic film Reefer Madness, you watch a group of perfectly healthy teenagers puff a joint, and within minutes descend into psychosis, sexual depravity, and murder. It's so over the top you almost laugh, until you realise people believed it. This wasn't harmless hysteria. These stories paved the way for the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, the first federal law to effectively criminalise cannabis in the United States. You're standing now in the courtroom as it's debated. There are only a handful of experts present. One of them, Dr. William Woodward of the American Medical Association, tries to explain that cannabis has legitimate medical uses, that the hysteria is overblown, that the law is vague and harmful. He's ignored. The act passes. From that moment on, cannabis goes from quirky cultural side character to outlaw. Grow it? You're a criminal. Use it? Same. It doesn't matter if you're a jazz trumpeter or a farmer growing hemp for rope. Suddenly the plant is poison, a problem to be eradicated. But not everyone's buying it. You find yourself walking into a smoky back room in New York, where the jazz scene hasn't died. It's just gone underground. Musicians still light up before sets. Writers still scribble late-night thoughts with a joint smouldering nearby. Cannabis doesn't disappear. It just goes quiet, shadowed, criminalised. The laughter is still there, but softer now, tinted with risk. This is where the scholarly debate gets sharp. Was the criminalisation of cannabis really about public health? Or was it a way to control marginalised communities under the banner of law and order? Most historians today point to the obvious. Anslinger's own words, the targeting of non-white groups, the complete lack of scientific basis. It wasn't about the substance, it was about the story, and the story had teeth. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the plant's other alleged source of moral decay, the crackdown is underway too. You travel across the border to see soldiers burning cannabis fields, arrests made for mere possession, and the same American propaganda echoing in Spanish-language headlines. Cannabis, once used in Mexican folk medicine and rural recreation, is now framed as the root of all urban unrest, which is rich, considering that tequila has never once been accused of starting a revolution. You start to notice the pattern. The more cannabis becomes associated with poor people, with immigrants, with black culture, with dissent, the more dangerous it's made to look. The newspapers, the films, the speeches, all designed to make the public uneasy, and uneasy people are easy to legislate. But here's your quirky historical twist. Despite all the bans and propaganda, the US government actually still supported hemp production into the 1940s. In fact, they launched an entire campaign during World War II called Hemp for Victory. encouraging farmers to grow cannabis, just the non-fun kind, for rope and uniforms. There's actual footage of government-backed videos explaining how to cultivate it, which means they knew. They always knew the plant had value. They just couldn't separate the fibre from the fear. You watch a farmer stand in his field, confused, planting the same crop he was told was evil just a few years earlier. No reefer madness, no gateway to crime, just rope, just cloth, just work. Back in the cities, the cannabis scene is ducking lower, moving into coded language, secret pockets, and jazz records with winks baked into the lyrics. You hear it in songs like Reefer Man and If You're a Viper. It's in the culture, no matter what the law says, because laws don't erase rituals, they just make them more creative. Now you're in Harlem again, sitting in a room where young artists pass a joint and talk about poetry, politics, and the nonsense of it all. Someone says, they fear what makes us feel free. No one argues. The smoke rises soft and steady. You look out the window and see the world changing. Faster cars, taller buildings, bigger governments. But down here, in this room, with this plant, time slows. Memory sharpens. The story continues, not in textbooks or headlines, but in laughter, music, quiet rebellion. The joint goes around again. Someone coughs. Someone sings. Someone dreams of a world that doesn't fear the way other people find peace. The smoke coils upward one last time, then fades, and with it the soft tap of jazz fades into the rumble of engines and the clanking of steel. It's the 1940s now, and America is at war, again. The world is burning, bombs are falling, and everything that isn't essential gets shoved aside, boxed up or painted in camouflage. And for a brief, strange moment, cannabis, of all things, gets drafted back into public service. You land in a field somewhere in the Midwest. It's bright, flat and humming with the sound of tractors. Uniformed young men walk rows of plants, not for a raid, not for a bust, but to inspect the crops. Welcome to the Hemp for Victory campaign, a US government project so ironic it almost folds in on itself. Less than a decade after the Marijuana Tax Act made cannabis a bureaucratic boogeyman, here it is, being grown by the acre, sponsored by Uncle Sam. You stand at the edge of the field, squinting at the rows of cannabis sativa. But again, this is hemp, the fibrous, low THC version. There's no high here, just rope. The Navy needs it. The Army needs it. It's used for parachute webbing, ship rigging, canvas, boots and more. Imported jute and other fibres from Asia have been cut off by war, so suddenly hemp is back in style. Temporarily, of course. The government even produces a short film titled Hemp for Victory, encouraging farmers to grow cannabis again. You find yourself in a cramped schoolhouse with creaky benches, watching the flickering black and white film with a room full of dusty overalls. The narrator calmly explains how to sow hemp seeds, how to harvest and process the stalks, and never once mentions the word marijuana. Because let's be clear, this isn't that kind of cannabis. This is the good, patriotic, non-giggly kind. And here's your quirky fact. For years after the war, the US government denied this film ever existed. It wasn't until the 1980s that a copy surfaced in the Library of Congress and blew the doors off that little historical gaslight, which tells you something, not just about cannabis, but about how easily the narrative around it gets scrubbed, rewritten, redacted. But the war ends, as wars tend to do, and with it, the hemp revival. Almost overnight, the same government that told you to grow it is telling you to stop again. The fields are abandoned, the processing plants shut down. Farmers are confused, some are angry, and others go back to pretending they never touched the stuff. Meanwhile, cannabis itself is still illegal, not just frowned upon, actively criminalized. You step back into the cities, where jazz clubs have quieted, and the new sound is swing. The cannabis that once swirled with the saxophones has now been locked up in police reports and parole hearings. The paranoia is rising. So are the arrests. You're now in a courtroom in a small town watching a teenage boy stand trial for having a joint in his jacket. The prosecutor compares it to heroin. The judge frowns like he's trying to decide whether this kid is a criminal or a contagion. And that's how the narrative gets cemented. Cannabis equals gateway. No middle ground, no nuance, just a one-way street to ruin. But here's the twist. While the official story hardens, the underground grows. Quietly, steadily, in working-class neighbourhoods, on college campuses, among beat poets who smoke and scribble in cafes, trying to find the words that still feel real. You drift into a smoky apartment in San Francisco, where someone's passing a joint and reading Jack Kerouac aloud. It's not rebellion. Not yet. It's just curiosity, connection, a refusal to accept that peace has to come prepackaged. There's a subtle shift happening here, a change in how people think about cannabis, not just as a substance, but as a symbol. For some, it's freedom. For others, it's danger. But nobody sees it as just a plant anymore. It's a placeholder for 100 other conversations about control, conformity, and whose joy is allowed. You follow the threads back to Mexico, where cannabis is still illegal but used widely, especially among rural communities and musicians. The term marijuana, spelled with a G, has become part of the culture, even as it remains a scapegoat for government crackdowns. You sit in on a corrida ballad, the singer strumming his guitar and laughing about the soldiers who show up just a little too late to find anything worth seizing. The song is playful, but there's something bitter underneath. In Jamaica, another thread is forming. Indian indentured labourers brought cannabis, ganja, with them in the 19th century. But by the 1940s, it's becoming a part of a growing spiritual movement, Rastafari. You sit with a group of men under a breadfruit tree as they light up and begin reasoning, discussing scripture, history, injustice. Ganja to them isn't just a plant. It's a sacrament, a tool to open the mind and commune with Jah. You listen as the words float upward like smoke, and you realise that this plant has been 1,000 things in 1,000 places. A rope, a medicine, a vice, a weapon, a path to God. And here comes the scholarly debate. Was the World War II hemp revival a genuine rediscovery of the plant's industrial value, or just a temporary convenience? Was the crackdown afterward about health, or about restoring moral order? And what would have happened if they kept growing hemp, kept studying cannabis, instead of stuffing it back into the vault of forbidden plants? You walk alone now through an abandoned hemp processing plant. The machines are silent, dust coats the gears. In the corner, a sign still hangs crookedly. Grow hemp for victory. It feels like a joke now, like a forgotten punchline to a war no one wanted to laugh about. But outside, something's still growing, in gardens, in windowsills, in the cracks of the sidewalk. Cannabis doesn't care about your laws. It doesn't need your approval. It just keeps pushing upward. You step out of the dusty warehouse and into a new sound, quieter at first, then rising into strange rhythms and improvised verses. It's the 1950s now, and America is trying its hardest to look tidy. Everything is beige and buttoned up. Suits are crisp, lawns are trimmed, fridges are futuristic. And yet, under all that clean white paint, something's rattling. You can hear it in the alley behind a diner in Greenwich Village. It sounds like a typewriter clacking through midnight, like a bongo drum echoing off brick, like someone whispering, "Dig it." You're in the world of the Beat Generation, a pocket of restless, dishevelled wanderers who don't buy into the post-war fantasy of cheerful conformity. These are poets, drifters, and writers who hitchhike across America, scrawl verse in gas station notebooks, and yes, light up joints in dingy apartments while arguing about truth and time. Cannabis isn't an accessory here. It's part of the ritual. The kindling for a mind trying to burn through the fog of a too-perfect society. You're in a smoky room with Allen Ginsberg and a few others, watching the weed get passed around with the same reverence some people give to communion wafers. Ginsberg's fingers are ink-stained and twitching with ideas. Kerouac slumped in a corner, half asleep, half writing in his head. You take a drag, and suddenly the ticking of a clock sounds like a Morse code message from God. Cannabis isn't new to these guys. What's new is how loudly they're willing to write about it. Not with fear, not with shame, but with openness. In a time when saying marijuana aloud could get you fired, these beats are naming it, celebrating it, embedding it into literature like a dare. They're not claiming to be experts or prophets, just guys trying to shake the dead weight off their souls. And here's your quirky fact. Allen Ginsberg once publicly testified in defense of cannabis legalization in the 1960s, long before it was fashionable, or remotely safe, to do so. He argued not as a doctor or politician, but as a poet. His position? That cannabis enhanced creativity and spiritual connection, and criminalizing it was just another way for the system to dull the human spirit. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, something quieter is happening. In London's bohemian pockets, cannabis is slowly making its way into artistic circles. Jazz musicians, writers and future rock stars pass it around in basement clubs, using it to soften the city's grey edges. But just like in the US, it's criminal, stigmatised, associated with foreigners and poor people. The elite might indulge, but they do so in whispers. Back in America, the authorities are doubling down. You find yourself in a courtroom again, but this time the defendant is a high school kid caught with a single joint in his locker. The judge is stern, invoking the moral decay of youth, and sentencing him not to rehab but to hard time. One joint, one kid, one ruined record. The newspapers eat it up. But the beats aren't backing down. If anything, they're lighting up more. You follow them across the country, on buses, into cafes, onto rooftops in San Francisco. The air is always thick with pot smoke and restless ideas. They write about time as a loop, love as a political act, God as a joke that only makes sense when you're high. It's not about rebellion for them, it's about clarity, seeing the gears behind the illusion. And here's the scholarly argument that keeps coming back like a hangover. Did cannabis really fuel their creativity, or was it just a crutch dressed up in poetry? Critics argue that the beats were more interested in being seen as transgressive than in actually saying anything new. Others believe cannabis was integral, a literal muse that softened the barriers between thought and page. Either way, it's in the work. You can smell it between the lines. You're sitting now in a coffee house with a cracked ceiling and a stage made from an old door. A woman reads a poem that sounds like it's being carved from her bones. She lights a joint afterward, not for attention, but because it's just what you do. A man in the back claps once slowly and says, "Far out." The vibe is somewhere between group therapy and seance. But the world outside doesn't understand. Parents are panicking, politicians are foaming at the mouth, and the media is having a field day. Beatniks on pot. Youth lost to drugs and poetry. The headlines turn cannabis into a cultural virus infecting everything pure and decent. You can almost hear Harry Anslinger clapping from beyond the grave. Still, cannabis finds new homes. It spreads beyond the coasts, beyond the jazz clubs and poetry readings, into college campuses, blue-collar garages, and lonely bedrooms in Midwest towns where nothing ever changes unless you smoke something and pretend it has. You duck into one of those garages now, two guys in rolled-up sleeves passing a joint between oil stains and broken radios. No philosophy, no politics, just escape. Something to make the clock go faster, or maybe slower. Something to make the nothing feel like something. That's the strange thing about this era. Cannabis isn't just one thing anymore. It's not just for the poets or the criminals. It's creeping into every crack of American life, weaving itself into everyday people's routines, quietly, illegally, insistently. You step back into the street. Somewhere a radio plays Sinatra. A kid flips a quarter on a payphone, and in the alley behind a bookstore, two teenagers are trying weed for the first time, laughing into their hands, unsure if they're high or just nervous. The country still thinks cannabis is a menace, but under the radar, in garages, cafes, dorm rooms and basements, something is building. A slow wave, a hum. Not loud yet, but steady. Like a joint passed hand to hand, the story moves forward. By the time the 1960s hit, everything feels like it's vibrating. The country isn't just shifting, it's shaking. The suburbs are still painting fences and waving flags, but underneath that glossy post-war smile, something's rumbling. You feel it before you see it, like a hum in the soles of your feet. And then, boom, you land in San Francisco. It's 1967, the summer of love. And cannabis, it's no longer in the corner, no longer whispered about. It's front and centre now, carried in backpacks tucked behind ears, rolled into joints the size of carrots and lit like torches. You're on Haight Street and it's chaos in the best possible way. Tie-dye, tambourines, barefoot prophets, girls in flower crowns, guys with beards like prophets who forgot the punchline. The smell of patchouli mingles with grilled corn and weed so pungent you could bottle it and call it Rebellion No. 5. This isn't jazz cool anymore, this is psychedelic loud, and cannabis has gone from accessory to anthem. You sit in Golden Gate Park surrounded by 100 people who look like they all just escaped from the same mystical garage sale. Someone hands you a joint and the label doesn't say sativa or indica. There is no label. Just a look, a nod, a puff, and suddenly the sky feels way too close. A guy beside you is playing a sitar with absolute confidence and zero skill. No one cares. Everything is warm. Everything is open. This is where cannabis shifts again. Not just a personal escape or artistic muse, but a collective ritual. People are getting high together, not just to chill, but to imagine a different world. No war, no hierarchy, no plastic smiles, just freedom, music, and consciousness. The politics start folding into the smoke. You sit through a teach-in at Berkeley where a student shouts, "Weed makes you question the system." Everyone nods like it's a religious truth. Civil rights, Vietnam, feminism, environmentalism, cannabis hitches a ride with all of them, turning up at rallies, in protest songs, in leaflets printed on hemp paper passed out on street corners with half-melted crayons. Here's your quirky fact. Cannabis was so central to the counterculture that the US government launched Project Chanunpa, a little-known surveillance effort aimed at tracking Native American religious practices, some of which included ceremonial cannabis use. It wasn't just the hippies getting watched. It was anyone whose use of cannabis crossed into political or spiritual territory. Meanwhile, the music world goes absolutely cosmic. You drop in on a Grateful Dead concert and can barely see the band through the haze. At Woodstock, clouds of cannabis roll over the crowd like spiritual fog. Dylan, Joplin, Hendrix, each with a different sound but all drifting through the same green smoke. Lyrics get looser. Guitar solos stretch for hours. Albums become journeys. You're not supposed to understand them. You're supposed to feel them. But it wasn't just the music. Cannabis was turning up at communes, co-ops and crash pads. It was a way to bond, to process, to soften the edges of reality when the world felt like it was on fire. And sometimes it was on fire. You walk through the aftermath of the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where protesters and police clashed, and the scent of tear gas lingers in the air. Someone nearby is still clutching a joint, lit despite the chaos, like a personal act of resistance. Here's where the scholarly debate gets louder than the guitars. Did cannabis cause the counterculture, or was it just along for the ride? Some researchers argue that weed helped people unhook from the dominant narrative, gave them the mental space to imagine alternatives. Others claim it was more symbolic than catalytic, a shared badge of belonging rather than a true engine of change. Either way, you can't tell the story of the 60s without it. You visit communes in New Mexico and Oregon, where people are growing their own food and their own weed. No labels, no packaging, just sun, soil, and trial and error. You watch someone carefully roll a joint while talking about non-violence and goat milking in the same breath. A kid runs past naked, giggling. A dog may or may not be stoned. You can't tell. No one minds. Of course, the backlash arrives right on time. You flip through newspapers with headlines like "Marijuana use exploding among youth" and "Drug culture threatens traditional values." Politicians start campaigning against cannabis not because it's dangerous, but because it's disobedient. Weed isn't just a drug, it's a flag, and the people waving it aren't pledging allegiance. Your feet take you to Washington, D.C., where congressional hearings about drug use sound like sermons from another dimension. One senator declares cannabis a first step on the stairway to hell. Another insists it's the reason young men won't fight in Vietnam. No one bothers to mention the science, because the real threat isn't chemical, it's cultural. Back in California, the vibe is still holding strong, but the seams are showing. The idealism of the early 60s starts curdling into something messier. Some people burn out, others drift away. The weed is still flowing, but the world is catching on and cracking down. Nixon's on the horizon with briefcases full of laws and a short list of enemies, and you already know what's coming next. But for now, you lie back in the grass at dusk, the scent of cannabis and eucalyptus in the air. Someone plays guitar nearby. Someone else reads Ginsberg aloud. You look around and realize that for a moment the dream is still alive, not perfect, not eternal, but real. Held together by music, belief, and the simple act of sharing a plant. You take another hit. The stars are just starting to come out. And for a little while, the world feels possible again. You don't hear him before you see him. Richard Nixon, looming like a thundercloud in a three-piece suit, jowls tense, voice dry as an old newspaper. It's 1969 now, and the incense-scented peace rallies are about to crash headfirst into the brittle, scowling reality of law and order politics. The flowers in your hair are starting to wilt. The music's still playing, but the volume's being turned down, slowly, deliberately. Nixon is in office, and cannabis. It's just been promoted from cultural symbol to state-declared threat. You're sitting in the back row of the Oval Office, not technically allowed, but you've slipped in under the cover of time travel curiosity. Nixon's pacing, ranting about dope fiends, long hairs, and how America needs to clean itself up before the rot spreads too far. And then he says it. Marijuana is public enemy number one. That line echoes like a gong. A new war is being declared, not on a country, but on a plant, and by extension on the people who happen to like it. And here's where it all kicks off. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970, Nixon's masterpiece of legal overreach. With a few strokes of a pen, cannabis is classified as a Schedule I drug, the same category as heroin. According to the government, that means it has a high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use, and no safety in any form. Doctors object, scientists protest, but it doesn't matter. The hammer has fallen. You walk out into the streets of America and feel the shift immediately. Police budgets swell, arrests for possession skyrocket, SWAT teams get new gear, prisons start filling with young people whose only crime was being caught with a baggie in the wrong pocket. And behind all this, a whisper campaign now shouted. Weed users are lazy, criminal, dangerous, not like us. But here's the thing Nixon never counted on. Cannabis culture doesn't vanish. It adapts. It changes shape. You drift into a college dorm in 1972, where a group of students is listening to Pink Floyd and passing a joint rolled with such precision it should be in a museum. They're talking politics, poetry, and what to do if someone knocks on the door. Weed hasn't disappeared. It's gone underground again. Just like in the jazz clubs, just like in the beatnik cafes, but now it's angrier, sharper. It has something to say. Meanwhile, the hypocrisy grows legs. You flip through a government report from the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, also known as the Schaefer Commission, which Nixon himself requested. And guess what? The commission recommends decriminalization. It says cannabis doesn't pose a major threat to society, that enforcement is too harsh, and that the criminal penalties do more harm than the drug itself. So what does Nixon do? He ignores it, throws the report in a drawer. Because this war was never about science, it was about control. Cannabis wasn't just a drug, it was a stand-in for dissent. And if you could demonize the drug, you could discredit the people who used it. Here's your quirky fact. There are tapes, actual White House tapes, where Nixon is heard saying cannabis should be illegal because it fuels the left-wing youth, the anti-war protesters, and the black civil rights movement. He talks less about public health and more about how to criminalize his political enemies without saying it out loud. The drug war wasn't born in a lab or a hospital. It was born in a paranoid strategy meeting. But out on the street, people are still lighting up. You visit a music festival, not quite Woodstock, but still full of swaying bodies and second-hand smoke. The smell of cannabis wafts over the field like incense at a collective baptism. Someone nearby is painting faces with glitter and saying things like, "The revolution will not be televised." You believe them, a little, even if they're stoned out of their minds. By the mid-70s, a few states are pushing back. Oregon becomes the first to decriminalize small amounts of cannabis in 1973. Alaska follows, then Colorado, California, Maine. The tide is trying to turn just a little. Activists are organizing, lawyers are arguing, and all the while teenagers are still sneaking joints behind 7-Elevens, convinced they're part of some grand conspiracy against boredom. This is also when NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, starts gaining traction. You sit in one of their early meetings, where a group of lawyers, activists and former hippies talk policy over sandwiches and ashtrays overflowing with roaches. They're trying to shift the conversation, trying to remind people that this isn't about drugs. It's about people, about freedom, about fairness. But even as the reform movement stirs, the pushback sharpens. You walk into a courtroom in Mississippi, where a black teenager has just been sentenced to 10 years for possession. 10 years for a joint. His mother weeps in the hallway while the judge goes to lunch. This isn't law, this is theatre. And here's the scholarly question still debated today. Did the drug war criminalise cannabis to protect public health, or to punish political dissent and communities of colour? The statistics scream the answer, but the official narrative, still shifty, still dressed up in the language of safety, morality and family values. Back on the West Coast though, something's happening again. The spirit of resistance is back. You see graffiti that reads, "Weed for Peace." You watch a group of Vietnam vets pass a pipe at a beach bonfire, laughing and crying at the same time. You You sit in a van parked outside a record store where someone is recording a pirate radio segment on how to grow your own. Cannabis in the 1970s becomes a paradox. Illegal, but everywhere. Condemned, but essential. People don't just smoke it, they organise around it. And it's no longer just about getting high, it's about not letting the system define you. The night settles in, and you find yourself in a field outside a small town, lying on a blanket next to a transistor radio playing Neil Young. The stars are bright. Someone lights a joint. No one's trying to make a statement tonight. They're just trying to feel okay, to breathe, to forget for a moment the weight of the world. You take a hit. The breeze is soft, and somewhere in the distance you hear the first cracks of the next battle forming. You exhale slowly, watching the smoke disappear into the early 1980s, a time that somehow manages to be both synthetic and severe. Everything is neon and hairspray on the surface, but underneath there's a pulse of panic. The disco ball's gone dim, the bell-bottoms have stiffened into pleated pants, and in the White House, Ronald Reagan has just announced that it's morning in America. But for cannabis, it's a bad dream dressed up in a cardigan. You step into a suburban living room where the TV's glowing. A perfectly coiffed woman turns to the camera and delivers her famous line, "Just say no." It's Nancy Reagan, giving the anti-drug movement a face, a slogan, and a tone so condescending it could make broccoli wilt. You glance around the room. A kid with a bowl haircut looks genuinely terrified. His mum nods approvingly. Somewhere off camera, a government budget triples. This is the beginning of a full-blown moral crusade, a branding makeover for the war on drugs. Cannabis isn't just illegal now, it's un-American, dangerous, the enemy of the nuclear family, the hard-working taxpayer, and the dream of Reaganomics. You watch as public service announcements pop up on every screen. A teenage girl holds up an egg. "This is your brain," she says. Then she cracks it into a frying pan. "This is your brain on drugs." You half expect the pan to burst into flames. The numbers are brutal. Arrests for possession spike again. SWAT raids hit houses over dime bags. Entire neighbourhoods are targeted, especially black and Latino communities, where cannabis use is no higher than anywhere else. But enforcement is louder, harsher, faster. Zero tolerance becomes the buzzword of the decade, followed closely by mandatory minimums. No more second chances. No more room for nuance. Just cuffs and sentencing guidelines printed in bold. And here's your quirky fact. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which created a sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine so massive it broke math. While that wasn't about cannabis directly, it set the tone. The war wasn't about substances, it was about symbols, who was using them, and how much power the government could get from saying no. You duck into a high school assembly where a man in a windbreaker is shouting about gateway drugs while waving a Ziploc bag of oregano for dramatic effect. The kids mostly roll their eyes, except the few who are now convinced one puff of weed will instantly turn them into an alley-dwelling vampire. The messaging is cartoonish, but the consequences are real, and yet the countercurrent is still alive. You slip into a college dorm where Pink Floyd posters still hang on the wall. A group of students is watching Fast Times at Ridgemont High, quoting Spicoli between hits. The fear hasn't reached everyone. For some, weed remains a rite of passage, a soft rebellion against the polished plastic of the Reagan era. Cannabis humour starts seeping into pop culture, whether the government likes it or not. Cheech and Chong are still out here, squinting and giggling their way through the hypocrisy. Saturday Night Live sketches poke fun at the overblown panic, and late-night TV keeps winking at the camera. You get the sense that the cultural split is widening between what the state insists cannabis is and what actual users know it to be. Still, the law doesn't laugh. You visit a courtroom in Texas where a man is facing years behind bars for growing a few plants in his backyard. He's not a dealer, he's a vet with back pain. But the judge doesn't care. The sentence is harsh, and the courtroom applauds. Fear is effective, especially when it's neatly packaged in televised slogans and clean-cut politicians. But behind the scenes, another conversation is starting to take shape. In California, a handful of doctors and activists begin whispering about cannabis's medical potential, especially for patients with cancer and AIDS. The science is early, the politics are dangerous, but the stories are powerful. You find yourself in a cramped apartment in San Francisco's Castro district. A man with sunken cheeks is sitting by the window, rolling a joint with trembling fingers. He hasn't eaten in days, not because there's no food, but because the chemo has wrecked his appetite. His friend lights the joint for him. 2 puffs in, and the colour returns to his face. He laughs. Not big, not loud, but enough. Cannabis didn't cure him, but it gave him dinner, it gave him sleep, it gave him a few hours where the pain receded like a tide. And for thousands of others living through the AIDS epidemic, it does the same. Word spreads, quietly from patient to patient, caregiver to caregiver. The government isn't listening, but the community is. Here's where the scholarly debate reignites like a pilot light. Did the war on drugs fail because it misunderstood cannabis, or because it deliberately ignored reality to preserve power? Was the damage done? Millions incarcerated, families separated, communities hollowed out, just collateral? Or was it the point? You sit now at a kitchen table littered with ashtrays, coffee cups, and photocopied flyers. Someone's drafting a petition. Someone else is calling City Hall. They're planning to take it public. Medical marijuana. Legal, regulated, compassionate. The next battle is taking shape, not just against the state, but against the decades of fear it left behind. Outside, the world is still hostile. You walk past a police cruiser rolling slow through a low-income neighbourhood. A boy tucks something in his sock and stares straight ahead. 2 white kids across town just smoked in their dorm and laughed about it. Nothing happens to them. The double standard is glaring. The laws are still cruel, but the people? They're not giving up. Not this time. Cannabis, now in its most vilified form, is also becoming its most resilient. It survives Reagan. It survives Just Say No. It survives the frying pan. Because the truth, once whispered in poetry and passed in rolled paper, is starting to sound more like a demand. The air in the early 90s feels electric and exhausted, like a storm rolling in over a burned-out battlefield. The drug war has carved deep scars. Whole neighbourhoods gutted by over-policing, prisons overflowing with people serving decades for ounces. But as the hangover of the Reagan-Bush era sets in, something unexpected starts rising from the ashes. Hope. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady. It begins with a whisper in hospital rooms and community centres, and it grows into a full-on movement. Medical marijuana. You land in San Francisco again, but it's different this time. Grimmer, quieter. AIDS has devastated the city. You walk through the Castro and see memorial posters stapled to light poles, quilts stitched with names and windows with photos of people who aren't here anymore. But even in the middle of the grief, there's a kind of stubborn light. A belief that suffering shouldn't be made worse by laws written in fear. You follow a man named Dennis Perron, a Vietnam vet and longtime activist, who's quietly selling marijuana out of his home. Not to party kids, but to dying men. Cancer patients. People with wasting syndrome. The government calls it dealing. He calls it compassion. And eventually he pushes for something bigger. You sit in on meetings where activists gather around worn-out tables and brainstorm strategy. They're tired, underfunded, half of them are sick. But they believe in the power of this plant. Not as a cure, but as relief, as dignity. They write up a ballot measure. It's called Proposition 215, and it proposes something radical for the time, legalizing medical marijuana in California. And here's your quirky fact. When Prop 215 hit the California ballot in 1996, it was the first time in US history that voters, not lawmakers, would decide whether cannabis could be used legally, and not just behind locked doors and whispered codes. It passed. Barely. But it passed. 56% of voters said yes. The floodgates didn't open right away. It wasn't like one vote turned dispensaries into Starbucks. It was messy. Cities pushed back. The feds threatened raids. People still got arrested, even with doctor's notes. But something had shifted. Cannabis had stepped out of the shadows and into the conversation again, and this time, it had patience on its side. You walk into one of the first legal cannabis dispensaries in San Francisco, a place called the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club. It looks like a cross between a church basement and a community clinic. There's no branding, no edibles shaped like gummy bears, just jars on shelves, soft music, and people quietly rolling joints in the back for folks too weak to do it themselves. And here's the kicker. Many of the early patients aren't just here for the weed, they're here for the space, the sense of safety. For once, they can talk openly about something that helped them eat, sleep, or simply not hurt. For years, cannabis had to be hidden. Now for a few hours at least, it can be passed in the open. But not everyone is celebrating. You step into a press conference where federal officials are condemning California's decision. The Drug Enforcement Administration starts raiding dispensaries. Activists get arrested. In one surreal moment, you see cancer patients in wheelchairs being cuffed outside a clinic while a news crew captures the whole thing. Public sympathy starts shifting, not because the laws changed, but because the images did. And here's where the scholarly debate sharpens. Was the medical marijuana movement primarily about health, or was it a strategic beachhead for broader legalization? Critics claim it was a Trojan horse, meant to soften resistance and normalize cannabis use. Supporters say it was the only way forward, fighting compassion fatigue with real, human stories. Either way, it worked. Soon, other states start to notice. Oregon, Alaska, and Washington follow suit with their own medical marijuana laws. Then Hawaii, then Colorado. By the early 2000s, the list is growing, quietly, state by state, like vines creeping through the cracks of a concrete wall. And the cannabis itself, it's changing too. You step into a home grow operation. Nothing fancy, just a garage filled with low-humming fans and plants under soft purple lights. These aren't wild roadside weeds. They're cultivars now, grown with intention. Named like comic book characters: Northern Lights, White Widow, OG Kush. THC percentages climb. Terpenes become a buzzword. The science is catching up to the culture. Back on Capitol Hill, the federal government still has its fingers in its ears. Cannabis is still a Schedule I drug. You sit in a congressional hearing where a doctor calmly presents evidence of cannabis helping with chronic pain, nausea, seizures. The committee nods politely, then pivots to asking about the children and gateway drugs. The policy doesn't budge. But out on the ground, things are moving fast. Cannabis is no longer just a protest symbol or a burnout stereotype. It's medicine. It's economic opportunity. It's a civil rights issue. And behind closed doors, politicians are starting to admit, maybe not into a microphone, that the drug war didn't work, that the costs have been enormous, that it might be time to rethink the rules. You attend a candlelight vigil outside a courthouse in Los Angeles, where a crowd holds photos of friends and family lost to harsh drug laws. Someone reads aloud the names of those still incarcerated for non-violent cannabis offences. A few of them were arrested in the same city now dotted with sleek new dispensaries. The injustice is glaring. You feel it settle in your chest like a weight. But then a cheer erupts from the crowd. News has come in. Another state has passed medical cannabis legislation. A ripple of applause, laughter, tears. You realise you're watching a movement still fighting, still organising, still growing. It's no longer just about getting high. It's about getting heard, about healing, about reckoning. And somewhere across town, under fluorescent lights and security cameras, a new dispensary opens its doors. A patient walks in, headscarf tight, hands shaking, and walks out with something that might help her eat dinner tonight. That might help her sleep. That might help her keep going. You step outside into the California night. The stars are out. The wind is gentle. And for the first time in a long time, the future smells less like fear and more like flowering cannabis. By the time the calendar flips into the 2000s, the world is buzzing with pixels, paranoia, and dial-up tones that never seem to go away. Everything's getting faster, smaller, louder. The towers have fallen, the wars have spread, and the culture that once marched in sandals and rolled joints on album sleeves is now figuring out how to Google how to make canna butter without getting flagged by the feds. You're in the digital age now, and cannabis is coming with you. You land in a dorm room that smells like ramen noodles and ambition. There's a lava lamp glowing in the corner, an iPod shuffle clipped to someone's hoodie, and 3 roommates sitting cross-legged on a carpet that hasn't been vacuumed since Clinton left office. One of them is packing a bowl, another's scrolling through an early message board where people rate weed strains like they're fine wine. Suddenly everyone knows what a sativa-dominant hybrid is. Cannabis culture, once passed by word of mouth in cafes and alleyways, is now searchable, shareable, printable. The genie is fully out of the bong, but there's something else rising with it. Data, studies, scientific curiosity. You sit in a university lab where researchers in lab coats, not tie-dye, are analysing cannabinoids under microscopes. THC is no longer just that thing that gets you high. It's a molecular puzzle piece. And CBD? That's the golden child now. Non-psychoactive, widely legal, and suddenly infused in everything from lotion to lattes. You blink, and now your grandma is texting you about full-spectrum gummies. At the same time, the medical marijuana movement is maturing. You visit a dispensary in Oakland, once underground, now licensed, regulated, and just a little bit corporate. The bud tenders wear lanyards. There's soft jazz playing. A guy in a polo shirt is explaining terpene profiles to a retiree buying cannabis for arthritis. This is a long way from Cheech and Chong. You half expect someone to offer you a membership rewards card. But it's not all smooth sailing. The federal government is still holding its line. Cannabis is still a Schedule E substance. Dispensaries get raided by DEA agents, even in states where they're legal. You sit in courtrooms where patients and business owners are being sentenced like drug lords. It feels like watching a play where half the cast thinks it's a comedy, and the other half still thinks it's a crime drama. Here's your quirky fact. In 2009, the Ogden Memo was issued. A little bureaucratic letter from the Department of Justice stating that federal resources shouldn't be used to target individuals complying with state medical cannabis laws. It wasn't a law. It wasn't even binding. But it was a signal. For the first time in decades, the feds were starting to blink. That same year, President Obama says offhandedly that he sees medical marijuana as an issue for the states to decide. It's not a declaration, but it's a shift. You can feel it ripple through the air. Suddenly people start talking openly. Legislators, celebrities, retirees. The narrative's changing, and cannabis isn't just surviving, it's rebranding. You walk into a conference center in Denver for the first ever Cannabis Business Summit, and it's like stepping into a parallel universe. Clean booths, branding teams, investors in pressed shirts asking about yield per square foot. The language has changed. It's no longer dealers and users. It's producers, patients, wellness professionals. Capitalism, ever the opportunist, has finally arrived at the cannabis table, and it's hungry. And the laws? They're racing to catch up. In 2012, you're in Colorado when voters pass Amendment 64, legalizing recreational marijuana. Not medical, recreational. You blink again, and Washington state follows. The crowd goes wild. The media goes haywire. The government mostly shrugs. What was once unthinkable has just become law. Not by revolution, not by riots, but by voting. The dispensaries in these states look like Apple stores now. Sleek counters, touch screens, loyalty programs. You watch a tourist ask for something mellow but good for hiking, and the clerk responds like a sommelier. Strain guides, test results, QR codes. It's weed, but make it professional. And here's the debate sparking in the scholarly world now. Has legalization sanitized cannabis? In its effort to go mainstream, has it lost its cultural soul? Critics argue that the corporatization of weed has pushed out legacy growers, co-opted the counterculture, and priced out the people who fought for it in the first place. Others say, good, about time. If legality comes with shiny packaging and tax revenue, so be it. Meanwhile, people are still sitting in prison for the same plant now sold next to cold brew and bath bombs. You walk into a panel at a cannabis expo titled Justice and Expungement, where activists are reminding everyone that while weed is now a billion-dollar industry, thousands are still behind bars for it. It's not just a footnote, it's a fracture. Still, the momentum keeps building. More states pass medical marijuana laws, then recreational, then others start to decriminalize possession. Each year, the map of America gets greener, literally and politically. The polls show public support climbing like a vine, crossing party lines, generational lines, income brackets. Cannabis is no longer just a subculture. It's becoming a norm. You sit in a barbershop in Detroit where two guys are talking about starting a grow operation. You sit in a classroom in Oregon where a professor teaches a course on cannabis law and ethics. You scroll through Instagram and see brands pitching weed as wellness, creativity, sleep support, intimacy enhancer. The plant is everywhere now, in every tone and form. Medical, spiritual, entrepreneurial, social. But here's the thing that keeps pulsing underneath all of it. This didn't happen overnight. This wasn't inevitable. It was fought for. By patients, activists, musicians, poets, people who got arrested, people who got sick, people who rolled joints and held signs and got laughed out of courtrooms for saying, maybe this plant isn't the villain. You end your day sitting on a back porch in Portland. The rain taps gently on the roof. Someone passes you a joint that smells like citrus and pine. It came from a dispensary. It's labelled, tested, legal. You light up, inhale. And somewhere inside that smooth, familiar exhale, you feel all the decades behind you, tangled, strange, hard-won, and all the possibilities still ahead. The future's not here yet, but it's close, and for once, cannabis isn't hiding. The joint burns down to the filter as you cross the invisible line between the late 2000s 10s and the shiny, chaotic now. You blink, and suddenly cannabis is normal. Not just tolerated, not even just legal, but practically expected in certain pockets of the country. The stuff of wellness blogs, real estate investments, chic dispensaries with subway tile and succulent walls. Weed has gone from beat poet's muse to soccer mum's sleep aid in what feels like a single exhale. You land in Los Angeles 2018, and the sun feels extra smug today. Not because it's warm, but because this is the year California fully legalizes recreational cannabis, and you can feel the smug in the sidewalk. You pass billboards with clever puns. Highly likely, weed the people, dispensaries open next to yoga studios and organic pet food stores. You walk into one that looks like a gallery. White floors, minimalist displays, bud behind glass domes like sacred artifacts. A bud tender with a neck tattoo and an MFA in photography welcomes you like you're entering a spa. But behind the glossy counter and the $60 eighths is the truth. This is still uncharted territory. You peek behind the curtain and see small growers trying to navigate zoning laws and fees so complex they could crush a spreadsheet. Legacy dealers who sold quietly for decades, now pushed out by big brands with deep pockets and compliance teams. Legalization brought legitimacy, yes, but it also brought capitalism's sharp elbows. Here's your quirky fact. In some newly legal states, there was such a rush to commercialize that dispensaries opened before systems were fully in place to track or tax the sales. In one instance, a cannabis shop legally opened its doors before the state had figured out what the tax rate was. The line still wrapped around the block. People weren't waiting for policy. They were waiting for a new reality. Meanwhile, the federal government sits there, arms crossed like a grumpy uncle refusing to acknowledge what's happening at the dinner table. Cannabis remains illegal at the federal level. Schedule I. Same as ever. But states keep shrugging. By the end of the decade, more than half of the country has legalized medical marijuana. Nearly a dozen states, and Washington, D.C., have gone fully recreational. And the federal silence starts to look more like denial than caution. You hop on a plane, legally carrying cannabis between legal states. Nope. Still a federal crime. But you do it anyway because everyone else is. You land in Denver, step into a dispensary where a barista-looking bud tender gives you a full breakdown of cannabinoid ratios. THC to CBD, CBG, CBN, THCV. It's no longer about getting high. It's about customizing the type of high. Functional, creative, sleepy, euphoric. You're basically doing pharmacology with a vape pen. And now, cannabis has a cousin tagging along, CBD. The non-intoxicating cannabinoid bursts onto the scene like an influencer that doesn't want to party. Just stretch, hydrate, and journal about boundaries. You see it everywhere. On chalkboard menus at juice bars, in candles, bath bombs, pet treats, truck stop gummies. It's in your uncle's knee cream and your co-worker's sparkling water. People who've never smoked a thing in their lives are now microdosing CBD to take the edge off. But here's the twist. A lot of it is unregulated. No one's testing the gas station tincture. Some bottles don't even contain what they claim. Yet the demand keeps growing. The idea of cannabis as wellness becomes more powerful than the plant itself. You visit Las Vegas, where cannabis is legal and neon lit, and walk into what feels like an Apple store mated with a nightclub. Glass floors, club music, a giant touchscreen menu that lets you sort by mood, strain, terpene, or occasion. You're buying weed like you're choosing a wine pairing. I'm having a beach day, but also dealing with unresolved childhood issues. There's a strain for that. But then you drive an hour out of the city to a small town where a guy is still serving time for possession with intent. He was caught with a few ounces in 2004. Now he watches from prison as cannabis becomes a legal multi-billion-dollar industry he can't participate in. He applied for a license to enter the legal market after release. He was denied because of his conviction. And there it is again, the core contradiction that legalization hasn't yet fixed. The same plant that built fortunes is still haunting people who used it before it was profitable. Activists are shouting about expungement, equity, reparations, and some states are listening. You walk into a policy meeting in Illinois where lawmakers are writing provisions for equity applicants, licenses set aside for people from communities disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. It's messy, imperfect, but it's a start. And here's the scholarly tension. Is the modern cannabis industry truly a liberation, or just a rebranding of prohibition, now with better packaging and fewer arrests? Has the soul of the movement been diluted in the THC vape cartridge of capitalism? Or is this what victory looks like in the real world? Flawed, incremental, but still progress. You spend time with longtime growers in Northern California's Emerald Triangle, people who risked everything to cultivate in secret for decades. Now, they're being boxed out by new regulations they can't afford to comply with. You walk through their drying rooms, smell the same sharp, earthy, terpene notes, and feel the weight of a bittersweet harvest. This is their life's work, and they're barely hanging on. But at the same time, new voices are rising. Black-owned dispensaries, women-led cannabis wellness brands, queer growers reclaiming space in an industry that's been historically bro-y and broke-backed. Social media gives them a platform. They host pop-up education events, build communities, use cannabis as a tool of healing and organizing. The grassroots spirit is still alive. It just wears better shoes now. You light up on a balcony overlooking a city that once banned weed with a vengeance. Now the skyline glows with dispensary logos and billboards for infused seltzers. You're older now, maybe just a little jaded, but still amazed. You remember the fear, the hiding, the arrest records, and now here you are, passing a legal pre-roll labelled with its THC percentage, batch number, and suggested music pairing. The air is thick with contradiction, with relief, with grief, with progress that still hasn't come fast enough. But you exhale, and for once no one's kicking in the door. You wake up in the 2020s, and everything smells like hand sanitizer and overripe bananas. The world is masked up, locked down, and doom-scrolling at 3 a.m. The pandemic has shrunk cities into living rooms and turned kitchens into classrooms. People are baking sourdough, cutting their own bangs and trying not to scream. And in the middle of this anxious, bleary-eyed chaos, cannabis does something wild. It becomes essential. That's right, essential. You watch it happen in real time, in the early days of COVID-19, when cities are shuttering bars, gyms, libraries. What stays open? Grocery stores, pharmacies, and in states where it's legal, dispensaries, cannabis stores. The same buildings that once got raided by the DEA are now being deemed critical infrastructure. Somewhere, a retired hippie is laughing into his sleeve while restocking a shelf of pre-rolls. You walk into a dispensary in Los Angeles and the vibe is calmer than the grocery store. Plexiglass dividers, masked bud tenders, hand sanitizer stations next to the indica edibles. A woman in yoga pants buys 3 tinctures and says, "This is the only thing keeping me from throttling my husband." The bud tender nods solemnly, like a pharmacist at war. Cannabis doesn't just survive the pandemic, it booms. Sales explode. First-time users show up in droves. Millennials turn to it for sleep, stress, and sour moods. Boomers come in for joint pain and immune system support. Gen Z. They're making weed TikToks and arguing about whether flower is vintage. Meanwhile, the numbers on the board keep climbing. Billions in legal sales, millions in tax revenue. And suddenly, politicians who once ran from cannabis like it was radioactive are now bragging about how much it's boosting state budgets. You get this bizarre moment where the same governors who campaigned on tough on crime now smile into cameras while praising the economic miracles of legal weed. That's America for you, where principles are flexible if the margins are strong enough. But there's more going on underneath the sales figures. As the pandemic forces everyone inside, people start rethinking things. How they live, how they work, who the rules protect. And that conversation spills into cannabis too. You sit in on a virtual town hall where activists point out the massive racial disparities that still exist in enforcement, even in legal states. In some places, Black Americans are still 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession, despite nearly identical usage rates. It's a fact that's as old as the war on drugs, but now more people are finally listening. You get another quirky stat. In 2020, while cannabis dispensaries were deemed essential businesses, nearly 40,000 people were still behind bars in the US for cannabis-related offences. Let that sink in. Legal weed on one corner, prison time on another, all depending on where you are, what year you were caught, and what colour your skin happens to be. That contradiction starts making headlines. Suddenly expungement isn't just a nice idea, it's a demand. States like Illinois begin automatic record clearing for low-level offences. New York writes social equity into its legalisation framework. California retroactively reviews old sentences. And more people ask, if we can legalise the profits, why can't we decriminalise the people? The industry begins to reflect this pressure. You walk into a Zoom pitch meeting with a group of black entrepreneurs seeking funding for a cannabis brand focused on mental health in underserved communities. They talk about stigma, access, equity. They talk about how cannabis has been used to punish people for decades, and how it can now be used to heal. Investors listen. Some say yes, a few say no. But the pitch happened. That means something. And while the US still wrestles with its patchwork of state laws, the rest of the world starts moving too. You jump to Canada, where recreational cannabis has been legal since 2018. The shelves are stocked. The packaging is bland. The taxes are high. But the arrests, almost non-existent. You hear mixed reviews. Some say it's too corporate, too cautious. Others say it works. People can grow at home. They can buy legally. They're not being locked up. In Europe, countries like Luxembourg and Germany begin flirting with legalization. Mexico's Supreme Court rules that the prohibition of cannabis is unconstitutional. Thailand legalizes medical cannabis and even allows limited home cultivation, something no one saw coming a decade ago. The global tide is turning, not just in whispers, but in legislation. Meanwhile, the plant itself is evolving again. You tour a high-tech cultivation facility where the humidity is precisely controlled by algorithms, the lighting simulates sunrise and sunset, and each strain is genetically mapped like it's prepping for a space mission. They're not just growing weed anymore, they're engineering it. High THC, high CBD, low THC, THC-free, terpene-rich, nano-emulsified, full spectrum, fast-acting. It's not your uncle's stash anymore, it's botanical technology. But there's still tension. You visit a small grower who's been crushed by compliance costs and tax rates. He's been growing since the 90s, before there were barcodes and security cameras, before the forms and licenses. Legalization, he says, doesn't mean fairness. He's not wrong. In some states, the very people who took the biggest risks to normalize cannabis are the ones being pushed out of the new economy. And here's the current scholarly debate. Is the future of cannabis heading toward justice or just convenience? Can a plant rooted in resistance truly thrive inside a capitalist system designed to reward the already powerful? Or is that just the cost of normalization, that the soul gets polished down until it fits inside a retail box? You sit on a park bench in a city where cannabis is legal, watching a couple of retirees giggle over a pack of infused gummies. Two teenagers nearby vape discreetly while debating the ethics of microdosing in school. A jogger runs past in a shirt that says Plant Power. A food truck offers CBD tacos. None of this would have made sense 20 years ago. And yet, here you are. Cannabis has gone from counterculture to consumer product, from street busts to Shopify, from jazz clubs to gummies shaped like sleepy bears. The plant hasn't changed, but the world around it has, and so has the way people use it, sell it, talk about it, and regulate it. You exhale, the wind shifts. Somewhere in the distance you hear the crackle of another law being rewritten. You don't know if it's progress or just a new version of the same old song, but either way it's playing, and the plant still growing. The future comes in quietly, not with a bang, but with a soft ping from your phone reminding you that your cannabis delivery is 5 minutes away. You're sitting on your couch in a hoodie, watching an algorithmically recommended documentary about ancient rituals, while your dispensary app asks if you'd like to reorder your favourite 5-to-1 CBD THC mints. This isn't science fiction. This is Tuesday. It's the mid-2020s, and cannabis has become so woven into the fabric of everyday life that you almost forget it was ever controversial. Almost. You still feel the ghosts. In the background of every branded vape and Instagram influencer strain review, there's the quiet echo of handcuffs snapping shut. But here, in this moment, the plant feels more accessible than ever before. It's legal in over half the United States, medically available in most of the rest, and the few remaining holdout states look less like guardians of morality and more like people who showed up late to the party and are pretending they meant to. You wander into a dispensary in New York City. It's all polished cement, reclaimed wood, and hanging plants. Some real, some fake. A playlist of ambient hip-hop rolls softly through the speakers, while staff in matching aprons recommend products based on mood, intention, and dietary preferences. A retiree in a Mets cap asks for something for sleep. A grad student wants focus. A mum in athleisure whispers about low-dose edibles she can take without anyone noticing. This is what cannabis looks like now. Not rebellion, not stigma, just life. And here's your quirky fact. By 2025, some cannabis companies have gone public on the stock market. Not in a back alley kind of way, but with suits and opening bells and analyst reports. There's a cannabis ETF. There are financial advisors who specialize in plant-based portfolios. Weed isn't just legal now, it's investment grade. But that doesn't mean the past has vanished. You attend a conference on cannabis equity where speakers from around the country share stories that are hard to hear. A man talks about being denied a license in his home state because of a 20-year-old conviction for a cannabis offence. A woman explains how her dispensary was approved in a social equity zone. But then a bigger company offered her a buyout she couldn't afford to turn down. One step forward, 2 buyouts back. Still, there are wins. States like New York and Massachusetts have started issuing licenses to formerly incarcerated individuals and prioritizing minority-owned businesses. Programs designed to repair the damage of the drug war are slowly, painfully taking shape. They're not perfect. Some are underfunded. Others get tied up in red tape. But the idea is there. Cannabis can't be truly legal until it's fair. You take a drive through the Midwest, where things are changing slower, but changing nonetheless. In Illinois, dispensaries operate in small towns that once arrested people for a single joint. In Missouri, voters pass adult use legalization at the ballot box, carried by a surprising mix of conservatives and libertarians who are just plain tired of seeing prisons filled for petty weed offences. Even places you'd never expect, deep red counties with more cows than people, start talking about the tax revenue, the job creation, the quiet sense of why not. Here's the scholarly debate still catching heat in university classrooms and city councils alike. What comes after legalization? Is the goal simply legal access, or is it reparation, restoration, and a rewriting of the story? Some scholars say cannabis is in danger of becoming just another commodified product, another thing to package, profit from, and forget the messy history of. Others argue that full normalization is the victory, that making cannabis boring is the ultimate sign of progress. You walk into a suburban chain store that sells cannabis alongside essential oils and yoga mats. There's an entire aisle for mindful relaxation, featuring hemp-derived Delta-8, CBD isolate, and herbal blends that smell like someone went full moonchild with a label maker. It's charming, it's weird, it's a little sad, but it's real. Meanwhile, the federal government is finally starting to catch up. You sit in the gallery of the US Capitol as lawmakers debate descheduling cannabis, removing it entirely from the Controlled Substances Act. Not just rescheduling it lower, but acknowledging that it never belonged there to begin with. The debate is cautious, full of legalese and nervous laughter, but it's happening. You hear the phrases interstate commerce, tax parity, research access. For once, cannabis isn't being discussed as a threat, it's being discussed like corn. You visit a grow operation in Arizona that feels like a spaceship. Rows of plants under LED light bars, each monitored by sensors tracking temperature, pH, and light exposure. Drones fly through the aisles misting nutrients. The growers wear clean suits. This is no longer a backyard hobby. It's agri-tech. Cannabis has joined the ranks of soy, wheat, and almonds, only with better lighting and more security. Yet for all the technological progress, something old still lingers. You visit a community garden in Oakland where neighbours grow their own cannabis, trade seeds, share advice. It's not about profit, it's about connection. You sit on a folding chair next to an elder who remembers when having a plant in your yard could get you 10 years. She smiles as she trims buds into a mason jar and says, "We're still here." And you believe her. And as the industry grows, so does the culture. Cannabis art festivals, infused dinners, sober curious events with cannabis cocktails, books, podcasts, documentaries, all digging into the tangled story of a plant that somehow became a scapegoat, a sanctuary, a crime, a business, and a hope all at once. You end the day at a rooftop party in Chicago where guests are offered joints on silver trays like hors d'oeuvres. A jazz trio plays. The sun dips low. You look out over the skyline and realise something strange. For the first time in generations, there's no need to hide. The plant is legal. The moment is quiet. The air smells like possibility, and a little like kush. And while there's still work to do, people to free, records to clear, systems to fix, something undeniable has happened. Cannabis made it! Not just to the surface, but into the light. The wind is gentle as you step into the near future, where the line between past and present is blurry, and the air smells like lavender and citrus-forward hybrids. You're walking through a downtown farmers' market, not some niche gathering of rebels, but a civic affair sponsored by the city council. There are booths selling sun-grown cannabis alongside heirloom tomatoes and handmade soaps. A woman in her 60s offers you a sample of her small batch tincture, designed for joint pain and emotional clarity. You nod, take a sip and realise, this is it. This is what normal looks like. It's 2030, or close enough, and the United States has finally done the thing. Cannabis is legal at the federal level. Fully, completely. Schedule I, gone. DEA raids, history. The final domino fell quietly, with a vote that made headlines for a day before getting buried under something flashier. But the impact is enormous. It's not just that cannabis is legal now, it's free in a way it's never been before. Interstate commerce opens up. You can grow in California, process in Oregon, ship to New York and sell in Florida. Suddenly weed moves like wine or wheat. There are national brands, yes, but also regional favourites. A boutique grow in Vermont known for earthy sativas, a South Carolina lab producing pharmaceutical-grade THC patches, an Oklahoma edibles brand with a cult following, and a TikTok presence stronger than most pop stars. But the industry hasn't swallowed everything whole. You step into a legacy shop in Northern California, wood-panelled, a little dusty, with jars behind the counter, and a cashier who's been rolling joints longer than most of her customers have been alive. The product is still good. The vibe is unchanged. There's a loyalty here, built not on branding, but on trust, reputation, and the kind of community you can't buy with venture capital. Still, money moves fast. You attend a global cannabis expo in Berlin, where attendees sip terpene-infused cocktails and tour vertical grow displays engineered for skyscrapers. The keynote speaker is an economist talking about global weed futures and sustainable hemp markets. Translation headsets buzz softly, while attendees from every continent nod and take notes. Cannabis is no longer a subculture. It's a global commodity, and a cultural one. Here's your quirky fact. By this point, more people work in the cannabis industry than in coal mining and steel combined. Bud tenders, cultivators, extractors, compliance officers, marketing specialists, research chemists. It's a full economic ecosystem. And while the industry's growing pains haven't vanished, the stigma almost fully dissolved. You see former police officers now working in regulation, doctors consulting for dispensaries, grandparents comparing edibles like they once did vitamins. And yet, the soul of the plant is still present. You attend a cannabis ceremony held by an indigenous healer in New Mexico. No phones, no branding, no sales, just ritual, smoke, silence, storytelling. Cannabis, like so many sacred plants, was never meant to be purely recreational or commercial. In this space, it's medicine, connector, reminder. You walk through a library in Detroit where a new exhibit titled Cannabis and the American Story fills the hall. Archival photos of jazz musicians, protesters, war veterans, dispensary founders. There are handwritten letters from prisoners, old Normal flyers, and the original Just Say No scripts next to a panel on social equity legislation. You watch visitors take it in, some nodding, some stunned. A father explains to his daughter how his brother was arrested for weed in the 90s. They both stand there, quiet, in front of a photo of a dispensary now operating in the same neighbourhood where that arrest happened. The scholarly debates haven't ended, they've evolved. In lecture halls and think tanks, new questions are being asked. Has cannabis been overcorrected into capitalism? Are there risks in marketing a plant as a cure-all? How do we preserve its heritage as it becomes a global product? How do you balance access, regulation and tradition? You sit in a grad seminar where students debate these issues passionately, not from theory, but from lived experience. Some grew up with cannabis as contraband, others only ever knew it as casual. You head to a rural town where cannabis saved the local economy. The factory closed years ago. The school almost shut down. But then came a cultivation facility. Jobs, taxes, a reason for young people to stay. Not everyone loves it, sure, but the difference is real. The coffee shop reopened. So did the library. People noticed. And now the final contradiction remains: justice. While many states have expunged records, many still haven't. You meet a man at a community legal clinic in Mississippi who's just had his 25-year-old conviction overturned. He gets emotional talking about missing his kids' graduations, job opportunities, whole chapters of life. And now he wants to open a dispensary, not out of spite, out of purpose, out of hope. And maybe that's where this story really ends, not with the legal milestones or business empires, but with the slow, quiet rebuilding. The people who step out of prison and into possibility. The ones who fought for years to make the plant legal and now teach others to use it responsibly. The communities that once bore the brunt of prohibition, now finding new identity, new opportunity, new peace. You light up on a hilltop under stars that don't care about policy. A low, warm breeze moves through the trees. In your hand, the same plant that's travelled centuries, empires, and underground basements. It's not just a high, it's history, it's resistance, it's medicine, it's memory. And now, finally, it's yours. Without fear, without hiding, just a little smoke curling up into the night. So now you're here, drifting at the end of a long, slow exhale, watching the embers of this story glow dim against the backdrop of time. You've walked through deserts and dynasties, danced in jazz clubs, crouched in smoky basements, sat through government hearings, and nodded off under starlit skies. All for a plant, one tiny leaf with 5 fingers and 1,000 stories. You've seen it worshipped, feared, burned, grown, banned, studied, smoked, and finally normalized. Not just a plant anymore, but a symbol, a question, a mirror. And what you realize as you settle deeper into your blanket is that cannabis never really changed. People did. Governments shifted. Cultures twisted. But the plant, it kept growing. Quietly. Patiently. Pushing up through cracked sidewalks and hidden valleys, winding its way through centuries of contradiction. It offered peace when the world wanted war. It offered focus when thoughts raced. Relief when bodies broke. Laughter when nothing else worked. It didn't ask for fame, or policy, or billion-dollar mergers. It just kept blooming. You remember the early humans in the mountains of Central Asia, huddled around fires, maybe giggling, maybe praying. You remember ancient rituals with incense and hemp robes. You remember jazz musicians rolling up backstage, students lighting joints behind bookshelves, protesters sparking up on courthouse steps. You remember patients fighting for one more legal hit, growers tending plants like poetry, entrepreneurs trying to build something that wasn't just profitable, but fair. And now, here you are, lying back, maybe feeling that soft pull behind your eyes, the fans humming, the lights are low. You made it through thousands of years in a single night, from Scythians to storefronts, from shadows to sunlight, and maybe you learned something, or maybe you just needed company while you drifted off. Either way, you're here, safe, soft around the edges, floating, and as your breath slows, just know the story's not over. The plant still grows, the laws still shift, the conversations still unfold, and you're part of it now. Just by listening, just by being curious, just by staying a little longer. Sleep well, traveller.